There has been a lot of talk recently about Next.js and what you get out of the box whenever you decide to create an app with it. And it's very often compared to things like Laravel, which come with a lot of things built in. And a lot of people that have tried Laravel kind of see it and see the fact that when you're working with Next.js, you kind of have to set all of this stuff up yourself. Lee has a really great post where he talks about why that is in the world of JavaScript. And ultimately, it comes down to the fact that we have a lot of choices, which can be a good thing. But ultimately, you have to make those decisions when you're starting a project to actually be productive and not spend all of your time picking libraries and setting things up every time you decide to go build a new application. Now, in this video, we are going to talk about Next.js, what it includes, and I'm going to show you how I build my own starter kit and how I pick and choose all of these various libraries. So this diagram here kind of shows you what you get out of the box. Anything in red is something that you don't get out of the box and you potentially have to make a decision about when you're deciding to build an application with Next.js. And really, we're talking about production-ready applications, software as a service applications, internal tools, not just blogs and landing pages. Things that get real work done and have real features require a lot of this stuff. Now, obviously, in a single video, I'm not going to be able to set all of this up, but I am going to show you my process of how I chose these various libraries to fill in these gaps, and also I'll show you how I set them up. So if that sounds good to you, let's dive in. My name is CJ. Welcome to Syntax. Now, before we go creating our own starter kit, let's actually take a look at the landscape of what exists out there today. So if you just head to GitHub and search for Next.js Starter or Next.js Boilerplate or Next.js Template, you're going to get a lot of results. And it can be very hard to determine if any one of these starter kits are for you. So I've filtered them down a bit, and I'm including starter kits here that have at least 1,000 GitHub stars. They're actively maintained. They have some style solution or UI framework. They include a database, and they include auth. I'm not including things that are just blog starters, marketing sites, or landing page templates. I really just want to have a good list of things that are production ready and give you all the base things that you need to build an application. Now, this obviously isn't an exhaustive list, and if you know of others, definitely leave a comment down below and people can check it out. And also leave a comment on this GitHub gist, which I'll link in the description and I'll add it to the list. But this has a few that I am going to point out here. And first, we'll start with CLI generators. Now, these are great because they pretty often allow you to make decisions as you're generating your app about which specific types of libraries you want to use for all of these various things. Whereas boilerplates and starter kits make all of those decisions for you and you're essentially just cloning down their repo. And probably the most popular generator that's out there is Create T3 App, which is essentially a CLI tool that will scaffold out an application for you. And you can choose, what do you want to use for your database, Drizzle or Prisma? Do you want to use TRPC? Should it set up authentication for you? And so a lot of people have gotten really good mileage of using T3 App and their CLI tool. Now, another one that is more recent is kebab-case, and it looks really cool. And so similarly, it lets you scaffold out an app. But what's interesting is you actually start with Create Next App. So you can guarantee that every project you start will at least always be as up to date as Create Next App is, which is very well maintained and does stay up to date. But then from there, it's a CLI tool that works within that code base to add and generate new things that you might need, like an ORM or authentication or setting up a component library and various other things as well. And another thing they provide beyond just setting up these libraries for you is a generation command. And so essentially this can scaffold out models, views, and controllers. And if you check out this video by Nico, you can actually see how it works. Or essentially you can run one command and it generates the database table, it generates the queries, it generates the page, and they can have like nested models and stuff like that. And so this is the kind of thing that I like to see that will really allow you to move quickly when building applications with Next.js. So definitely check out kebab-case. Now, another CLI I came across is called Superplate. And you can see on their landing page that they support a ton of libraries and frameworks. And specifically, if you look at the Next.js section, you can see that you can use their CLI to add all of these things to your Next.js app. The one thing that does seem to be missing, though, are things around like database and authentication and authorization, but they actually do have a really cool plugin system. So it would be possible to create your own custom plugins that add those kinds of things to your Next.js applications. So Superplate seems pretty cool as well. Now, lastly, there's the NX CLI. So NX is a monorepo tool, but they also have project generators for all kinds kinds of things, not just Next.js. And I'm including it in this list because if you're already working in an NX mono repo, they have a way of getting up and going with a Next app inside of that mono repo very easily. And they do have a couple of sub-generation commands that can generate like pages and components for you. But this does not come with like a UI library or auth or database setup or anything like that. But it does include a few more things than you get with just the create next app CLI. Now, next up, we have starter kit and boilerplate repos. So essentially to use these, you would literally clone down the repo and just start working from the code base that they provide. Now, I'm not going to go in depth on all of these, but I essentially went through and found all of the ones that have like at least 1,000 GitHub stars and are regularly maintained and updated. Like this one was last updated 3 days ago, 4 days ago, last month, yesterday. So all of these are actively maintained. And that's one of the things you want to look out for when choosing a boilerplate, because packages go out of date very quickly, right? And if someone is not on top of keeping that package.json up to date and also like fixing any breaking changes or anything like that, that base code base is going to go out of date very quickly. So check out this list. You can see all of the libraries that they include, but you just want to make sure whatever kit you choose is up to date and maintained. Now, next up, we specifically have SaaS starter kit. So this is software as a service. And typically this is a starter kit that also has like Stripe integration. So you can start accepting payments, and also thinks about the idea of like multi-tenancy, where you potentially are going to have multiple entities that are all using your application, but their data needs to be separated in a certain way. These starter kits try to handle that. Now, a very recent one is from Lee Robb, and he's been working on this in public. You can see his last commit was 54 minutes ago. Now, Lee actually works at Vercel and works on the Next.js documentation. So if you had to trust one of these starter templates, I would definitely trust this one because it's actually coming from somebody that knows the framework really well. But it is fairly new, and Lee is still working on it, but this one is definitely worth a look. Now, there's a few others here. Like I said, I'm not going to dive deep into them, but they all have some way to accept payments. And then also a lot of them have things that will help you out with sending transactional emails. Like this one includes React email, and this one includes like webhook orchestration and integrating with an audit log service. This one has a focus on multi-tenancy, and this one includes other things you might need like internationalization or error handling with Sentry. So they're definitely all worth a look, especially if you already have some opinions about maybe what kind of database you might want to use or whatever else, so you can pick your starter kit accordingly. And then there are also paid offerings. So these are just some of the ones that I could find that essentially provide a software as a service template built with Next.js, but you do have to pay for it, which is completely fine. I think building out one of these starter kits, especially one that stays up to date and is structured really well and allows you to build quickly, is a time-consuming process. And so, of course, it would make sense that people want to get paid for their time, especially if it's coming from more experienced developers or people that have a lot of experience building with Next.js. So a lot of times you're basically paying that premium for their expertise. All of these are worth checking out. I actually don't know much about the creators of any of these, so I'm not saying you should use one over the other. There are probably other ones that are out there, but with paid offerings like this, a lot of times you're also paying for support, right? So like if something isn't working, there's somebody that could potentially help you out. Or if something is broken or there's a bug, they're probably going to be a lot quicker to help you with what you need than potentially opening an issue on a GitHub repo. So yeah, all of these are worth checking out. And lastly, I want to talk about toolkits and wrappers, because this is a whole other avenue to explore. And one of the first ones here is Blitz.js. Now, I've talked about it a little bit on the channel before, but they call themselves the missing full stack toolkit for Next.js. So it's not a starter template. It's not a boilerplate. Essentially, you still are building a Next.js application, but there are quite a few libraries and helpers behind the @Blitz.js namespace that provides a lot of the things that you typically need in an application, like authentication and like RPC and like multi-tenancy and like databases. So it's cool to see that projects like this have popped up, because it's basically just another layer on top of Next.js. And one of the things about starter templates and boilerplates that I'm not necessarily a fan of is the fact that you have all of this setup code that you potentially only ever touch once, but it exists in every single one of your applications. And so a project like Blitz is essentially abstracting away some of that setup, so that way you don't even have to think about it. You can literally just import it. And so I definitely like that idea as well. Now, the last one to check out here is Refine. And this is really more than just like a CLI and a tool. It's more of an ecosystem, and it works with more than just Next.js. This diagram kind of shows you what you can get with it, where basically you have all these different kinds of platforms that you might be building with, like Next.js, and all these different kinds of UI frameworks and auth providers and data providers and real-time providers and integrations and access control. And Refine essentially allows you to bring all of those things together in a very streamlined way. So it's definitely worth checking out as well. They have this whole idea of like data fetching and data loaders, and you essentially use it inside of your Next.js application, but it's a lot more opinionated, so it can take care of some of these things as well. So Refine is definitely worth a look. Now, like I said, if there's something that should be in this list but is not, leave a comment down below. I'll be sure to add it. And at this point, we're not going to talk about existing solutions anymore. We're going to build our own. So the rest of this video is just me setting up a Next.js app from scratch and making all of these decisions about the various pieces I need to have a production ready code base. So everything in blue here, you're going to see me setting up in this video, and it'll also talk about why I made a specific decision about the library that I'm choosing. Now, of course, you may not like the decisions that I'm making in this video, but that's why I'm showing you my process, because if you want to do the same thing, you can go through and build your own starter kit that works for your company or your team. So definitely check the description where there will be timestamps to all of the sections of the video where I am not only setting these things up, but also talking about why I chose a specific library. Now, the first part of this video is all about getting really good base settings for ESLint, Prettier, Tailwind, and TypeScript and VS Code, and making them all work really well together. So even if you don't agree with the libraries that I choose for the other parts of this video, you definitely can find something useful in this section of the video that just really talks about code formatting and linting and code style. First, let's generate a Next.js app. So I'm going to copy the command here from next.js.org, run it in my terminal, and we're going to call this next start. We're going to use TypeScript. We'll be using ESLint and Prettier, which we'll set up next. We're going to be using Tailwind. I like to put all the code in the source directory. This makes it easier for any sort of dev command that specifically needs to look at source files. And that way, all of our configs are at the root, but our actual source code is in the source directory. So yes, we like the source directory. Also going to use the app router, and we're going to use these import aliases, but we're not going to customize them. And here we go. Now let's cd into that directory that got created and open it up with VS Code. You can see our app gets generated with this eslint-rc.json. Now this has some good defaults. Essentially, Next TypeScript has all of the recommended settings for ESLint, but ESLint is for linting. We want to also add Prettier for formatting. So let's do that. Now you can see in the Next.js documentation, they tell you how to set up Prettier. Essentially, we can just grab the ESLint config Prettier package and install it. So I'll head to my terminal, run that command, and now we can add this to our eslint-rc. So within our eslint-rc, we're just going to add extends Prettier here. By adding Prettier here, we're essentially disabling any ESLint rules that might conflict with our formatting rules that are enabled by Prettier. Let's create our Prettier config. I'm going to create a .prettierrc.json, and I'll specify my preferred Prettier settings. Now, this is where you might actually diverge from my preferred settings, but I prefer semicolon, so I'm going to set that to true. And then I like double quotes, so I'm going to set single quote to false, and I like a tab width of 2. And then lastly, I like a trailing comma to be compatible with ES5. So these are my preferred formatting settings. Again, yours may differ, but just set those up inside of your Prettier RC. And now I'm just going to do a quick reload of VS Code, and this should allow everything to kick in. Now, next up, there are a couple of linter rules I can enable that are not formatting rules. And this is one of the main reasons I still like to use ESLint and not just Prettier. So let's take, for example, using regular functions as callbacks. So let's say I have an array, and then I do like a for each, and then I pass in a function here. Okay, great. I have a little anonymous function. We're logging out every item from the array. But one of the things I prefer in my code base is if I have an anonymous callback, I want that to be an arrow function instead of a regular function. And there's actually an ESLint rule that can automatically fix that for us. So if we go to our ESLint config and then add a rules section, there is a rule called prefer arrow callback, and I'm going to set this to error. So once I do this, now we get a linter error that says, hey, you should use an arrow function. And if I run ESLint fix all auto fixable problems, that automatically converts any anonymous functions in callbacks into arrow functions inside of callback. So that's great. And again, this isn't a formatting rule. This is now a linter rule, but I like the fact that it can be fixed automatically with that specific linter rule. Now, another linter rule I like is to prefer template literals. So let's say I have like a first name variable, and then I have a last name variable, and then I want to combine these together into a full name variable. And so you might do something like first name plus space plus last name, and then we'll just log out that full name. Okay, awesome. Now, technically there isn't anything formatting wise wrong with this code, but if I want to use template strings everywhere, there is a linter rule for that. So if we head back over to our ESLint-rc, here we can say prefer template and set that to error. And now with this, you can see that it's saying, hey, some unexpected string concatenation. You should use a template string instead. And again, this is automatically fixable. So if I run Command-Shift-P, fix all auto-fixable problems, it instantly converts that into a template literal. So that's great. Now, a couple more rules I like to enable, which is not a popular thing to do, is I actually want to see an error if I don't have semicolons or if I'm using the wrong kind of quotes. Now, typically you use something like prettier because you don't want to have to worry about formatting errors like quotes or semicolons. But personally, I do like to see in my file if I'm missing a semicolon. So we can just add that rule here inside of our eslint-rc. So inside of here, I can say semi and then set that to error. And now inside of the document, if I'm ever missing a semicolon, I actually see a linter error that says I'm missing a semicolon. Now, again, you may not want to see this rule. Just don't enable that rule if that's the case. And the other thing is I like to see a linter rule if I'm using the wrong kind of quotes. So if I have single quotes here, I actually want to see a linter rule that says you should use double quotes. So for that, we'll add a rule that says quotes, and we'll say error for double. And now you can see I get a linter error that says it should use double quotes. But again, if we run eslint fix all auto-fixable problems, that'll update that to be double quotes. Now, I don't want to always format and lint manually. I actually want my editor to do this for me whenever I save the document. And for this, we can specify some VS Code settings. So in our directory here, I'm going to set up a .vscode folder. And inside of there, I can create a settings.json. Now, I like to specify these settings specifically inside of the project because if any other developers are working on this project, they're going to get these exact same settings instead of having to set them themselves inside of VS Code. The first setting is to just format on save. So I'm going to set editor.format on save to true. So anytime I save the document, it's automatically going to run prettier. And then I also wanted to run eslint fix all auto-fixable problems every time I save the document as well. And so for that, we have editor.code actions on save. And in here, I can say source fix all and set that to always. And now check this out. Whenever I save the document, things will be automatically updated. So let's say I go back to where I had like the function here, and then this was actually string concatenation. And then maybe up here, I was missing a semicolon and I'm using the single quotes. Okay, so there's a bunch of stuff wrong with the document. If I press save, boom, it just fixes everything automatically. Now, next up, another linting and formatting rule that I like is to automatically sort the imports at the top of a file, because this can get really messy if you have like aliased imports and relative path imports and third-party libraries, and they're all kind of like intermixed at the top of the file. You can sort these in a specific order. And for this, I like to use this prettier plugin sort imports. And what's nice about it is it can essentially group things into specific areas. And there are rules and regular expressions you can specify to sort them into specific areas. So you can see that if you have some code that looks like this, you can set it up so that third-party libraries are at the top. And then you have some aliased server imports here and some other alias imports here and then relative imports here. And it can put a space between them. So it's nice and clean and easy to look at if you ever need to go back up and modify those imports. So let's add it to the project. I'm going to install it. And then from there, we're going to add it to our plugins inside of our prettier RC. And then we can specify our sorting settings. So I'm just going to copy the settings that they have specified in their docs, throw those there. So import order separation means it's going to put a space in between the different types of imports. I prefer that. You can turn this off if you don't like it. And then import order sort specifier says that within each group of imports, it should sort them alphabetically. And then lastly, import order is where you can specify the order of how things should be sorted. And by default, third-party libraries are always going to be at the top of the file. And if you want them elsewhere, you can specify within this array, and I'll show you that in a second. But with this, you can see that any relative imports are always going to come at the end. So if we take a look back at this file, and let's say I put that relative import at the top, and let's say I put this there, whenever I save the file, it's automatically going to sort them. You can see that it put the relative import at the bottom, and then it sorted these imports in alphabetical order. So if I swap them in this way, they're always going to be in alphabetical order. Now, to see more of these rules kick in, let me actually create some other files. So here in the source directory, I'm going to create a folder called components. And then for now, I'm just going to create an example component so I can show this working. This will just be a super simple component. Okay, so now let's say I want to import this example component into this file. I can import it using an import alias. So if I say import example from, I can do @/, and whenever we generated our Next.js project, we specified that we wanted that default import alias. So now with the @ sign, anything inside of the source directory can be imported. So I'll import components /example, just like that. And then we'll use this component for now, just like right there. If I save the file, it actually pushes that import to the top because it doesn't know that this is an import alias. It just thinks it's a third-party library. So to fix that, we need some custom rules. And these rules that it has here are going to vary depending on your type of project. I actually don't use this convention in my project, like core, server, or UI. So I'm going to remove those and specifically add a rule that looks for things that are aliased with @/. And so here's a nice little regular expression that says if the import starts with the @ sign followed by a slash followed by anything else, that should appear before any relative import. So if I save that, come back over here and save the file, now you can see I have a section for all of my aliased imports. Now, lastly, one of the things I like to do is put everything that's related to React or Next.js at the very top of the file, then any third-party modules after that, and then our aliased imports, and then any relative path imports. And that looks like this. So essentially, this is a regular expression that says if an import comes from React or from Next or next/something, that should appear at the top of the file, followed by any third-party modules. That's anything that you installed from npm, followed by aliased imports, followed by any relative path imports. And so now if I also, let's say I imported from Lodash, I don't know, we did something like this. Whenever it formats this, it's always going to put it in that specific order. So we've got Next to React, third-party, aliased, and then relative imports. Now you can customize this order to your heart's content. What I see a lot of people do as well is not only just have aliased imports here, but you might separate these out. So depending on what your directory starts to look like, you might say, oh, well, I want to see all of my components listed above any other relative imports. Or maybe I have some utils and I want those to be listed here. Or maybe I have some hooks and I want those to be listed here. So you can specifically choose where you want those to appear and in what order. For my app, I just like to have all of my aliased imports in one spot because I know anything that's aliased is going to be coming from my app directory, and they're ultimately going to be sorted in alphabetical order anyway, so they're going to be grouped all in one section. Now, our last prettier plugin is specifically for Tailwind. Now, you may not know this, but the order of classes inside of your class attribute actually doesn't matter. What matters is the order that those specific classes are defined in the CSS file. And this plugin takes into account the order that they're defined in inside of Tailwind and automatically sorts them in that specific order. So you'll see which classes actually have precedence because they'll be in the order of how they're actually defined in the generated Tailwind CSS. If you're not following, just read this article. It explains it a lot better. So we're going to install this specific plugin here, and then we're going to add it to our plugins in our prettier RC. So we're going to copy that. We'll throw it on here. Now that I have that plugin added, I'm just going to reload VS Code to make sure that all of those settings are picked up. And now if we take a look at our page.tsx, you can see that it has quite a few Tailwind classes inside of here. And if I save the file, you'll see that it actually resorts these classes because actually min height screen is technically defined before some of these other classes that are in here. And because we enabled auto format on save, anytime you save the document, no matter what order you put those Tailwind classes in, they're automatically going to be sorted in the proper order. So yeah, this plugin is great. Make sure that you're actually defining these in the order that they're defined in so you don't run into any weird issues where you're thinking that you're overriding something when you're actually not. Now, lastly, let's set up a script that will actually run prettier on all of our files. So we head over to package.json. So here, I'm just going to add a task called format. We're going to run prettier, specify that it should run on the source directory, and then it should actually write those files. So after formatting, overwrite those files with the formatted codes. So now that I have that script, if I run npm run format, it's going to look at all the files inside of the source directory, and if there needed to be any sort of formatting changes, it'll overwrite them. Now, next up is a linter setting we can add that will prevent us from running into case sensitivity issues. Now, this was inspired by the Next.js FAQs. So these are FAQs from the Next.js Discord. I highly recommend you check these out because there's a lot of good tidbits of info for when you're working in your Next.js app. But this one specifically talks about module not found cannot resolve some module name. And it talks about potentially using camel casing, whereas when you're on a case-insensitive operating system like Windows, it doesn't differentiate that versus all lowercase somefile.js. And so because of that, the recommendation is actually to always use lowercase and to use kebab-case naming for all of your files. Now, they even mention that this isn't popular in the React community, but I've been using it in my projects and I like it. It actually looks a lot more consistent. And I know for some people, seeing kebab-case is a lot easier to read than camel case. Now, to implement this, we're actually going to take a look at the bulletproof-react repo. So if you haven't heard of bulletproof-react, it is a GitHub repo that has recommendations for how you should work inside of a production React and now Next.js code base. So just last week, Alan updated the guide to also have recommendations for the app router and pages router in Next.js. but they have a section that talks about file naming conventions. So let's take a look at it. So if you go to their repo, they have a bunch of different sections on project standards and structure and testing and all the stuff that you should care about in a production code base. And maybe if you don't have your own opinions yet, you can actually take a look at this repo and it will give you the opinions that you need. And for this, we're going to take a look at the project standards section here in Bulletproof React. And they actually talk about eslint and prettier and give you some example codes for setting up your own configurations. But down here at the bottom, they talk about file naming conventions. And there's actually a plugin for eslint called check-file, where you can add a rule that specifically says files should be kebab-case. So let's set this up. We need to install eslint-plugin-check-file. If we search for eslint-check-file on npm, you can find it eslint-plugin-check-file. And then we'll just need to install this. And then we're going to throw these settings at the bottom of our rules here in our eslint-rc.json file. But this actually needs to be in JSON format with like double quotes. So I'm just going to convert this really quick. I just found a random online converter to throw these in. Nice. Now I have like a nice copy pastable JSON version of that. So if we put it in, sweet, looks good. And so now any file we define has to use kebab-case, or we're going to get a linter error. And then also any folder we define will have to have a kebab-case as well. Now this is specifically saying that you can have a directory called tests with beginning and ending with underscores. I don't use that, so I'm just going to make this say that every directory should use kebab-case like that. And then for these rules to actually work, we need to specifically add the check file plugin here to our RC file. So we'll throw this in. So now with that plugin installed and these rules enabled, let's see if it works. So for instance, this component, let's actually rename it to example thing using camel casing. And you'll notice immediately we get a giant error inside of the file that says the file name does not match kebab-case. So if I really wanted to call it example thing, I would have to do example-thing like that. And then the linter is happy. Now, if you're not used to kebab-case, this might take some getting used to, but personally, I like it a lot. I actually like the consistency because seeing these lowercase file names, which is the Next.js convention, combined with capital camel-cased files, once you have a bigger code base, it's harder to parse when you're like looking at your list of files. With kebab-case, it's nice and separated and easier to read. So I actually prefer it. I recommend giving it a try, but especially so that you don't run into these weird file naming issues if you have developers that are working in different operating systems. Now, another great set of rules that they provide for you in Bulletproof React has to do with project structure. Now, I'm not going to enable these in this specific template, but I definitely recommend you give this a read because it talks about what your top level folders should be and can be. And then from there, it has some specific rules about preventing imports from various parts of your application. Because if you start to structure your application in terms of features, then you can prevent this import spaghetti where like this feature imports from that feature by having these rules enabled and make it so that if this thing needs to import the same thing as that thing, it actually just needs to be moved into utils or some standardized location. So definitely take a look at these. I'm not going to enable these in this project, but it's definitely worth a look to prevent that like import spaghetti across your application. Now, there are a few more project-wide settings I can set inside of my settings.json file here. And this next one makes it so that if I have any unused imports inside of a file, it automatically removes those because typically it's like unused code. So I can say source.organize imports, set that to always. So let's say I was importing cache from React for some reason, but then like I'm not using it anymore. Now you can see I have a linter error which says cache is declared, but its value is never read. When I save the file, it's automatically going to remove any of those unused imports. And our last project setting has to do with CSS. So if we take a look at our CSS file, you can see that by default, these Tailwind directives are unknown and we're getting an editor warning, but we can tell VS Code when it's looking at a CSS file, it should use Tailwind. So inside of here, we're going to add files.associations, and we're specifically going to look at any CSS file and tell it that it should use Tailwind CSS. And now when I'm inside of a CSS file, I get autocomplete with Tailwind and it's aware of it and I don't get any sort of weird warnings or errors. Now, another project setting has to do with the version of TypeScript that's running inside of VS Code. And because we're using TypeScript with Next.js, we want to make sure that the version of TypeScript running in VS Code is the same version that Next.js is using. And so if you look in the Next.js docs, they tell you how you can do this. And so inside of VS Code, if I have a TypeScript or TSX file open, I can press Command-Shift-P, search for TypeScript, select TypeScript version, and you're going to want to choose use workspace version. And you can see that VS Code's version is 5.5.4, but the version installed by Next.js is 5.6.2. So we'll select that, and you can see that in your settings.json, it added this section here. And a TypeScript setting we can enable specifically inside of Next.js has to do with statically typed links. So in our next config, if we set experimental typed routes to true, then whenever we're dealing with the link component, we'll get type errors if the href doesn't match a specific path within our application. So I'm going to open up my Next.js config, and inside of here, we're going to set experimental typed routes true. Now with that setting, if I'm ever using the link component, I'll get a type error if I specify a path that doesn't actually exist within my application. Now, when you're working in the Next.js app router, every single page is called page.tsx and every layout is layout.tsx. And also you might have components that are in a folder, and inside of there you have index.tsx. If that's the case, you might benefit from this VS Code setting. So essentially what it does is it makes it so that the tab bar displays the name of the page with the word page and the name of the layout with the word layout, instead of seeing the full path. So you don't see a bunch of page.tsx all over the place. Now, personally, I don't even use tabs inside of VS Code, but if you do, this is a nice setting to enable. Now at this point, let's just clear out all the extra stuff that I'm not using. So I'm actually just going to delete this components folder for now. And then in my layout, I'm going to get rid of everything, including the local fonts. Also set up my metadata, and then remove any of this extra stuff here. Get rid of that example component. Cool. So nice and basic layout here. And then on our main page, I'm just going to get rid of everything and just have a nice little hello world. And so if I start up my next app, we should see hello world. Great. But you can see it has some default styles where it's setting like the background color to black and the foreground color to white. So if we look in our globals.css, I'm actually just going to remove all of these default styles because we are going to be installing a component library that sets all of our styles for us. Just like that, we have no styles. It's just the basic Tailwind reset. Now, another thing is let's just get rid of the fonts that got installed, and then also this default Vercel favicon. And one of the fun things we can do is we can actually set our favicon as an emoji. So there's actually this CSS tricks article that tells us how we can do it. Basically, you do it by specifying an SVG that has an emoji inside of it. So we can copy this link, and then here inside of our layout, we'll throw it in the head, give it a closing tag, and then specify the emoji that we want to use. And I'm actually just going to choose the package emoji because this is a starter kit with a package and such. Cool. So now that I have that, I go back to my app, you can see that the favicon here is set as that emoji. Now from here, I'm actually going to start installing specific libraries that I like to use for like UI components and authentication in my database. And I realized that you might not make those same choices. So I'm actually going to put this base setup with all of my ESLint settings and prettier settings and project settings on a branch called base. So if you want to look at that without seeing all the other stuff that I install and set up, it's going to be a specific branch called base in the repo that's linked in the description. Next up, I'm going to set up a Tailwind-based component library. Now, our app is already ready to go with Tailwind, and if you're not familiar with Tailwind, it is essentially a CSS utility library. But Tailwind doesn't give us any pre-built components. They essentially give us utilities we can use to build our own components. And the best example of this is to kind of just look at what they show in their documentation that talks about what Tailwind is. And so in a traditional CSS framework, you might actually have some class names like chat notification or whatever else. But if you look at the Tailwind implementation, there are no class names. They are just a bunch of utilities. So we have P6, max width, margin auto, background white. And so all of these are utility classes that are provided by Tailwind that essentially allow us to style with CSS, but without having to directly specify classes inside of a CSS file. Now, there's a lot more to Tailwind than just that. Essentially, it's also a design system. So even though we see P-6, that's a padding of 6, but that doesn't mean 6 rem. 6 is a unit in their design language. So it actually means 1.5. But once you get used to their design system, it's nice and easy to use. And all of your CSS is kind of scoped to where you defined the components. Now, I'm not here to sell you on Tailwind. We are going to use it and we're already using it, but I want something more than just these utility classes. And for that, I am going to choose a component library. And essentially component libraries take the building blocks of Tailwind and give us reusable components so we don't have to write everything from scratch whenever we're using and defining components. Now, sometimes Sometimes we will if we want to customize it, but it's nice to have things that come out of the box already styled so we don't have to build up button styles from scratch. Now, one of the most popular component libraries out there is a library called shadcn UI. You've probably heard a lot about it recently, especially with the launch of their CLI and integration with V0. But essentially, they give you components that are ready to go. You don't have to assemble all of the Tailwind classes yourself. So for instance, if I want to add this button to my app, all I need to do is import it, and then I get a nice styled button that also supports like other variants like secondary, destructive, outline, and I don't have to write all the custom CSS for that. But the thing about shadcn is all of these components are very minimally styled. And so I would say shadcn is a really good choice if you have your own design system or branding in mind, where you want to take these base components and highly customize them to fit your specific look and style of the kind of website that you're building. But they provide a really good base. And the interesting thing about shadcn, also one of the controversial things about it, is you aren't actually installing the library. They have a CLI tool that literally copy pastes the component code into your application. So if you look at this manual tab here, literally this is all of the code required for this button component, and this file will live inside of your code base. But because you have direct access to the source code, you can modify it and customize it to your heart's content. So that's what shadcn is really good for. Essentially, they give you the base styles and base components that you would then further customize within your app. And again, every single one of these components, if you bring it into your application, that source code is going to be living inside of your application. It's not an npm dependency. Definitely take a look at their introduction. They have an FAQ that talks about all of those things. But for me specifically, a lot of the apps that I build, I'm not designing all of the styles from scratch. A lot of times I'm building like a quick prototype, or I'm just trying to get some internal tool ready to go, and I don't necessarily need highly custom styles. And because of that, I'm actually going to choose a library called Next.UI. Now, this actually has no relation to Next.js. It's just called Next.UI, but it's a component library based on top of Tailwind that has some default styles. So if we take a look at these buttons, they're a little bit more stylized, right? They don't look as plain as like the shadcn ones. And essentially, if you pull these components into your app, you're basically saying your app's going to look like this, maybe with a few slight modifications, because of course you can always customize the styles by adding new Tailwind classes, but these give you good styles by default. Like if we look at the card component, we can see a lot of like highly stylized elements that are pretty much built in and ready to go. Now, this library is installed as an npm dependency, and whenever you need to use one of their components, you're actually importing from NextUI org. But of course, you actually don't have any way to modify the source code of this button component. The only way to customize it would be through like the props that they make available. And then of course, you can always pass down custom CSS classes. And if you take a look at their section here called Overriding Styles, they talk about basically the mechanisms they provide for customizing it. But because you don't have direct access to the source code for it, sometimes your customizations might be limited. And for the apps that I'm building, that's completely fine. Most of the time, I'm just going to be using the default styles provided by these components. But it's really great that I don't have to add any of my own Tailwind CSS classes for most situations. I can literally just import the component in and it looks good by default. I might add some maybe like padding or margin or layout styles to customize my app further, but the base styles of all of these components are essentially what I'm going to be using, and this is how my application is going to look when I choose these components. Now, a few other popular libraries you should take a look at are Headless UI. Headless UI is very similar to shadcn in that they are completely unstyled. They're very like minimal generic styles, and essentially these are more interactive components that need some JavaScript behind the scenes. And if you take a look at them, you actually do import directly from the installed library, and they give you these reusable components, but they're completely unstyled, and you can look at their docs for further styling them. And like I said, they actually don't provide a ton of components because they're ultimately providing some of the JavaScript functionality you might need for more interactive components. Because if you are building out your styles completely from scratch, you wouldn't necessarily want to implement all of the functionalities of these types of components from scratch yourself. These are nice because you get some base functionality, and then you can further customize the styles and move on from there. But there aren't a lot of components included because it's expected that you're likely going to be styling all of the other things yourself from scratch with Tailwind. Now, the last two I'll point you to are Flowbite React and DaisyUI. Give them all a try and pick the one that you like the most. But specifically for my starter kit, I'm going to be using NextUI. I have been testing out all of these libraries, and this is the one that I like the most. It has most of the components that I need. The styles look good by default. It's customizable in the way that I want to, and it works really well with React Server components. So this is one of the other aspects of choosing one of these component libraries, is if they have not been updated or they're not aware of this idea of server and client components, it might make it so that anytime you want to use one of their components, you literally have to only import it inside of a client component. And that gets really cumbersome, especially if you just want to like show a button inside of a server component. For like Flowbite and DaisyUI, these haven't been updated yet to support React Server components. So any component you want to use has to be inside of a client component, but that is not the case with NextUI. You can actually use these components inside of server components, and all of their components have the ability to be server-side rendered. Now, there are probably a lot of other libraries based on Tailwind that give you React components that I didn't mention, and maybe I don't even know about. Let me know down in the comments if you know of a library that you like to use that's based on Tailwind and gives you React components. But for my starter kit, I'm going to be using NextUI, so that's what we're going to set up in the next section of this video. So to get started with NextUI, we'll head to their documentation, and they have an installation section. Now, they actually have their own CLI, which allows you to generate different types of React and Next applications. But I tried it out, and it generates a lot of extra stuff that I don't necessarily want in my app. I kind of want to be in control of most of the things that get created. So we're actually going to go the manual route. But you should definitely check out their CLI if you're interested to see how they set things up. But if we head over to manual installation, we can install the packages that we need. Now, because I am using pnpm, I do need to add this to my npm rc. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So here in my repo, I'm going to add a .npm rc file, throw that in there, and then we can install the dependency. So I'm going to add NextUI org React and Framer Motion. Now, since I just updated my npm rc to change that pattern there, we do need to run a pnpm install first, which is going to recreate the directory with that new setting, and then we can install NextUI. Now we can set up Tailwind. So if we open up our Tailwind config, we essentially just need to tell it that it should look at the NextUI components as well. So we'll head over here, and you can see this Tailwind config got generated when we created our Next.js application. But all of my code is going to live in the source components directory and source app directory. I'm not using the pages directory, so I'm going to remove that, and then I'm going to add the NextUI org includes here at the bottom. Now we are going to be using dark mode and light mode, so I want dark mode set to class, and then we can pull in the NextUI plugin. So we're just going to set that here, and then we can import NextUI like that. Now these settings here were actually generated whenever we created our Next app. We don't need these, so I'm just going to set these back to empty. Great. From here, we need to set up the NextUI provider. Essentially, any NextUI component needs to be a child of the NextUI provider. So we're going to set that up inside of a providers component and then wrap our entire application in that. So if we look at layout.tsx, this is the main entry point for any page that gets rendered or any component that gets rendered in our app. And we want to wrap this in all of our providers. So let's actually create a provider component. I'm going to create a folder in source called components, and then I'll create a file in here called providers.tsx. Then we'll export a function called providers, and this is going to take in some React children. So we'll add children here, and then we need to pull in that NextUI provider and wrap the children in that. So we're going to return, we'll grab our NextUI provider, import that, and then render the children inside of it. Now we can set up our props here. Essentially, children is just a React node, so I can just call this a React node and then import that from React. So this provider component is going to include all of the providers that we might need as we set up the other things inside of our application. And so we're actually going to include this in the layout. So now that I have this component over here in my layout, I'm going to grab my providers like so, and then we'll render the children inside of there. Make sure you import it from components, and we should be good to go. Now to test this out, let's actually just try adding a button to our homepage and see if it renders in the correct way. So to do that, we just need to import the capital B button component. So over here in my codes, let's go to the page, and we'll make this a capital B button instead of an H1. And then I can import that button from NextUI. So we'll save that, we'll start up my app and see if we get a button. And we do. So NextUI is all set up. We can start importing components and using them in our app. Now let's get a basic layout. So I essentially just want like a navbar and then a main area. So I'm going to grab the navbar component, and there's a couple of different things you can do with it. So by default, we just have like a navbar at the top with like a logo here. And the one that I want to do is the one that will automatically collapse on smaller screens like this. So you can see that when you're on a smaller screen, you get a menu that looks like that. And then on larger screens, you show the links there. So this is what I would like. I'm just going to go ahead and copy copy this entire example and pull it into my own component in my app. So let's do just that. Here in the components folder, I'm going to create a new file called app navbar.tsx. Now, of course, you could just call this navbar.tsx, but I don't want it to conflict with the Navbar component that I'm importing from NextUI, so I'm giving it an app dash prefix. So in here, I'll paste that example that I grabbed and then rename the export to be app navbar. Now, this example is bringing in a logo. I'm just going to remove that for now and then get rid of the logo down here. And then we can try using this component. So in my layout, I want to bring in that navbar and make it the first child of the providers here. So here, I'm going to grab app navbar like so, and let's see if it worked. It needs to be a client component. So you can see the code that we copied in is actually using React's use state to know whether or not that menu is open. So we need to actually specify this app navbar component as a client component so that way we can use state. So here, I'm just going to say use client, save it, and there we go. We have a navbar up at the top. Awesome. And to test out the automatic collapsing, let's see. Yeah, so when it's on a smaller screen, it collapses. We have a nice menu. Cool. So I'm just going to go in and remove all those extra things and just maybe have like one link to profile, because we're not going to have many pages for this starter template. It's just going to have like one profile page. So here we can see that it is specifying menu items as strings. I think instead I'd actually like to specify these as objects that have like a label and an href. And for now, we'll just have two links. We'll have one that goes back to home. So we'll say the label is home and the href is just slash. And then we want another item where the label is profile and the href is slash profile. Great. And so now whenever we're iterating over these items, we're going to use the label and the href. So here I'm going to say item.label when we're rendering it out. And instead of specifying a color, we're just going to get rid of that. And the href can actually just be item.href like that. But now I also want to use this array of items when the menu bar isn't collapsed. And you can see right now, these are kind of just hard coded in. So essentially I need to iterate over them in the same way, but instead of rendering navbar menu items, I just need to render navbar items. So let's do that. So right in here, I'm going to paste this, but instead of a navbar menu item, it's just going to be a navbar item like that. And then we can get rid of these hard-coded ones. Save. And now we have two links, home and profile. And then when I collapse, we also have those two links inside of there. Sweet. So one thing I noticed is that these navigations are actually full page navigations instead of like single page application navigations once the app has loaded. And we can actually fix that with NextUI. So in the NextUI docs, if we look at the routing section, they talk about how to set this up with the router. So that way, whenever navigate gets called on the built-in link component for NextUI, it actually will use router.push from next, which will make it behave as like a single page application page load. So let's get this set up. So if we head over to our provider, inside of here, we can use the router and make sure you pull in the one from next navigation. That is the latest one. And then we can pass it in here. So we can say navigate is router.push. Now, right now, I'm actually getting a type error because I set up typed routes in my next config. So this is a setting that we set earlier. If you look in here, you can see we set typed routes to true. And essentially what's happening is the router.push is expecting those paths to be real paths within our application, whereas the navigate function on NextUI provider is just expecting it to be a string. I'm not going to worry about fixing this right now. And in other scenarios where I want typed routes, I'll probably use the built-in link component instead of the link component provided by NextUI. But for now, I'm just going to do a ts expect error. So that way it's not throwing a TypeScript error anymore. And then I do have to enable this with eslint. So if you press command period on any one of these errors, we can say disable this eslint error for this one line. And so we are explicitly ignoring that error, which should be fine. Essentially, we just won't have type completion whenever we're using the link component from NextUI, but that should be completely fine. And then one last thing is because we're using use router, this can only be called inside of client components. So now our provider's component here is going to be a client component. So I'm going to just say use client like this. Now, if we head back to our app, we can test it out. So if I try going here and then navigate back, you can see that those errors stick around. So it's actually using that built-in navigate function. Now, one thing to note is there's actually a bug with the navigate function here in NextUI provider. I'll link this issue in the description, but essentially, I think it boils down to using different types of package managers. They actually, for whatever reason, when they get bundled, that navigate function isn't working in the correct way. But the one place where it does work is with PNPM. And so because I'm already using in PNPM, I'm not running into this issue. But if you run into issues with their built-in in link component or anything that's using that navigate function, check out this issue. It might have to do with the package manager that you're using, and it also could be fixed by the time that you watch this video, but just note that there is an issue there. At this point, I also want to change the name of the app here and then also add like a logo. So let's do that. If we head back over to our navbar right here, instead of saying Acme, I'm just going to say Next.js Starter. That looks good. And then I want to add an icon. And for that, I'm going to install an icon library. Now there are 1,000,001 icon libraries, but the one that I have really liked and has had many of the icons that I need is a library called Tabular Icons. And they actually have a React library you can install that will give you React components that wrap these specific icons. So we're going to do just that. Let's set it up. If we head over to the documentation and then head down to the section for the React plugin, we can get a specific install command. So I'm just going to grab this install. We'll run it here. And now we can start using icons. And so every icon inside of this package starts with capital I icon. So we can just search for that and then automatically import it. So let's do that. Essentially right here, I want to add my logo before it. So I'm just going to say icon, and then you can see we have all of these icons from Tabular. And I know that they have a package icon. So I'm going to do this. So icon package. And now if we look at our app, got a nice little package icon. Sweet. But essentially anytime I need an icon, I'm just going to pull in that component from Tabular icons. All right. At this point, you've probably noticed that every time I go to the page, it's like blinding me because it's like really bright and white. Let's enable dark mode in our dark theme and also add like a theme switcher in the navbar. So if you head to the NextUI docs, they have a section on dark mode, and specifically they let you know that you can set it up with a package called Next Themes. So that's what we're going to do. We'll grab the install command here, and then we can add the Next Themes provider inside of our providers component. So if we pull open providers, we can then import these, and then we're going to wrap our Next Themes provider in our children here. Great. But now that things have been switched around, we do need to pull this linter error back down to be right above the navigate command there. And you can see in their documentation, they also set attribute to class, and then they set a default theme. I'm not going to set a default theme because I want to actually use the user's system theme, but we are going to set attribute to class because that's how we have it set up inside of Tailwind. So I'll set attribute class. Now let's create a theme switcher component. Essentially, I want a little button that I can toggle, and that'll change the theme between dark and light. You can see they provide us a simple example one here. Let's just grab this and then we'll modify it. So in our codes, in the components directory, I'm going to add a new file called theme switcher and then throw this code inside of here. Now you can see that it's pulling in use theme from next themes. And this essentially gives you what the current theme is set to and then a function to change that theme. And when a user specifically sets their theme, this library is actually going to set it inside of local storage. So it always has their preferred theme when they come back to your website. But if they haven't set a theme, then it will actually pass in the system theme. And so we actually want to look at this as well. And I'm actually just going to log out what these are when the component loads so we can see them and then write the code to work accordingly. So now that I have that, let's actually bring the theme switcher into the navbar. And for now, I'm just going to render this out right after these items here. So I'm going to add a navbar item and then add the theme switcher inside. Okay. So now you can see that the current theme is set to system. And if we look at those console logs, you can see that theme is set to system and then the system theme is dark. So essentially what I want is when the user comes to our website, I want to show them their preferred theme. I don't want them to have to toggle to dark mode or always default to dark mode. So let's actually create a custom hook for that because I don't want to have custom logic in here every time I call this use theme function. So in my codes here, I'm going to create a directory called hooks. And then I'm going to create a file called useSystemTheme. Then we'll export a function. And essentially what we'll do inside of here is we'll grab the theme, the system theme, and the set theme function from the use theme hook that's provided by Next Themes. So we'll pull this in. We're going to grab all those same things. And then we can see I have a linter error. So I completely forgot that I enabled the kebab-case rule. And so I actually do need to name this useSystemTheme. And that's actually a lot more readable than the camel case version, at least I think. Again, it comes down to preference. Okay, so now inside the hook, if the theme is set to system, we want to return the value of the system theme. Otherwise, we want to return the value of the theme. So for this, I'm actually going to use a use memo, and I'm just going to return a use memo from React that is dependent on all three of those values. And here we're going to return an object that has a theme property, which should be some value, and it's always going to have the set theme value on there. Now, theme needs to be the system theme if theme is set to system. So right here, I'm just going to have an inline ternary. So we'll say if theme is equal to system, then we want to return the system theme. Otherwise, we want to return the theme itself. Now, if we look at the return value of this function, we can see that theme is either string or undefined, and then set theme, it takes in a string. But I want a little more type safety here, so I'm going to create a type where the theme can only be dark or light. So let's do that. I'm going to have a type called theme. This will be dark or light. And then I also want to have a set theme type that takes in that theme instead of taking in a string. So I'm going to copy this type here. We'll call this set theme. It'll be this. I need to bring these in from React. And then instead of a string here, we will set this as theme. But now we can use these types. So right here, I'll say we'll return this object, but theme is of type theme, and set theme is of type set theme, like that. And so now anywhere I use this hook, we're going to have a nice typed value where theme can only be dark or light, and set theme is a setter function that can only take in dark or light. So now let's use it inside of our theme switcher. So instead of calling use theme here, we're actually just going to call useSystemTheme and pull it in from our hooks directory. And now we should specifically have a theme value that is either dark or light. And so instead of having these two buttons, let's actually add a switch or a toggle component that will allow us to toggle back and forth between light and dark theme. So if you look at Next.UI, they have a component that is called switch. And this is exactly what we want. You can actually see they have an example with icons that is almost exactly what we need, which is like light and dark theme. So let's grab this code and then we can change the icons that we specify. So here we're going to add the switch component, pull that in, and then instead of sun icon, let's pull this in from tabular icon. So if I say icon sun, they have an icon sun. There we go. And they very likely have an icon moon as well. So I'll grab icon moon, and that's coming in from tabular icons as well. So let's see what we get. Look at that. We have a nice little toggle button. So let's actually make it work. So you can see in their docs, they have this controlled section where essentially you can specify is selected and what happens on value changed. So is selected should be true if the theme is light. So let's set that up. Let's say is selected, and this is going to be if theme is equal to light, and we get this type completion, which is nice. So selected if it's light, and then we can specify on value change, which will explicitly call our set theme function. So on value change, we'll say if theme is equal to dark, then we're going to set the theme to light, and otherwise we're going to set the theme to dark, like so. So now we should be good to go. By default, let's see, you can see that it has selected dark mode, and then if we toggle it, it turns on light mode. Very good. We have a nice little switch. I'm actually going to hide this label here, but let's actually just say this is called theme, and I want to also include this switch inside of my collapsed items here, but I only want to show the label if it's inside of the collapsed item. If it's in the navbar, we're actually going to hide that label. So let's take in a prop that is just show label, and this is going to be a Boolean. And if show label is true, then we'll actually show this label here. So we're going to wrap this in that, and we'll just say show label and that. And let's actually make it so that this prop is not required. We're going to set this as optional like this, and that'll make it so that by default, it's not going to show the label, but then you can pass in show label as true. Okay, so we've got the theme switcher here. I also want to add it here inside the collapsed menu. So we'll just grab this, and inside the collapsed menu, I think I want it at the top instead of at the bottom. And this will actually be a navbar menu item instead. So we'll save that. And in this case, when it's in the menu, I do want to show the label. Okay, so by default, it's here. We don't see a label. And then when it's collapsed, we do see a label. Sweet. Now, I have actually been ignoring this warning here, but let's take care of it now. So you can see that whenever the page renders, it says extra attributes from the server, class, and style. And this actually has to do with the fact that whenever Next Themes kicks in, it actually sets a class attribute on the HTML element. So if we look at the inspector here, we can see that our HTML element has the class dark, and then everything else can actually use that. So Tailwind uses that, NextUI uses that, and it's all based on that class name being dark. But when we render it from the server, it doesn't have this class name dark. So we need to take care of that. And if we take a look in the Next Themes GitHub repo, in their README, they talk about this. So right here, they're saying that theme provider is a client component and not a server component. And if you do not add suppressHydrationWarning, you're going to get warnings. And this is actually pretty scary to do because it's like, wait, if I'm adding this at my top level, so if we go over to our app and then layout, they actually want us to add this suppress hydration warnings there on the HTML element. But it's important to note that this only applies to this level of components. If you have any hydration warnings lower level down in the tree, like inside of other pages or components, you're you're still going to see that hydration error, which is a good thing. So this is essentially just suppressing that hydration error for the HTML element, because when it renders on the server, it's not going to have that class element. And so now if we reload the page, we don't get that hydration error, and our theme still works. Next up, I want to create a basic layout so that the main area here always takes up the full container, and also will make it look nice with like a background image. So what we need to do, and first I'm going to turn on dark mode because I'm blinded right now, is we have our body here. I want my body to take up the full viewport width and height. So inside of our layout on the body, I'm going to add some Tailwind classes. We're going to say we want width screen and height screen. And these will respectively set 100 view width and 100 view height. And so now if we look at the body, it's taking up the full viewport. Next, I need this first child here to take up the full width and height of its parent, the body. And this div is actually created by the NextUI provider. So if we take a look in our providers component, this is the element that's creating that div. So really all I wanted to have is a full width and height. So let's add a class name. We're going to do width full and height full. And now this element takes up the full width and height of the parent. From there, I want the navbar to always take up the amount of space that it is. And then I want the main element where all of the children are going to be rendered. I want that to always take up the rest of the space inside of the container. So to do that, I'm going to set this UI provider div to be a flexbox and make it so that the main element with the children is a flex grow. So on this element, we're going to just say flex. That'll give it display flex. We'll do flex column, so that way it's vertical. And then in the layout, we'll create a top level element that will take up the rest of the space. So right below the navbar, I'm going to add a main element. We'll throw children inside of there, but now main should have flex grow. So we'll add the class flex-grow, which sets a flex of 1. And now we've got our body, which takes up the viewport. We've got our UI provider, which takes up 100% width and height. We've then got our navbar, and then we have our main element, which grows to the size of the rest. And then any page is going to be rendered right inside of that main element. So let's update our main page to not just be a button. Let's actually add some content. So if we go to our index page here, I'm actually going to render out a card. So card comes from NextUI. And then inside of there, I'm going to have a card body, and then I'll add a title, and I'm just going to call this the Next.js starter. And below that, we'll add a little description. We'll say a simple starter for Next.js. Ooh. And so just like that, we've got a nice little card, but I don't want the card to always take up full width. And for that, let's just set a max width on the card here. So I'm going to set max width, and we'll use medium, which is 28 rims. Cool. So got a nice little card there. And then I want this to be centered on the page. So I can do MX auto. So that's automatic margin in the x-axis. Great. Let's make this look like an actual title. So on the H1, we'll give this a text 5XL. Nice. And then I also want this to be centered. We're just going to center all of the text. So on the text body, let's give this a class name of text center. And that looks good. And I want to increase the font size of the little paragraph tag here. So let's give this a text XL. Great. Now, lastly, I want to set a full page background image on that main element. So no matter what page we're on, it always has a background image. This is just a style that I want for my site. You don't have to do this. But for this, I'm actually going to use a background generator. So if you haven't heard of it, there's this site called Fuel, and it has a bunch of cool little CSS and canvas tools and SVG generators. And specifically, I want to use this generator. It's called Motif. And I'm going to generate a nice background here. So let's actually increase these little boxes, and then let's make these dark. So I'm going to generate two different images. I'm going to generate an image for dark mode, and that should be like that. So I can copy as SVG, and then inside of my app, I'm just going to throw this SVG in the public folder. So let's create a folder called public, and then inside of there, I'm going to create a file called darkbg.svg, and then throw the SVG code inside of there. Cool. And then let's do the same thing, but we'll save a light version of this for whenever we're in light mode. And how about E? That looks good. So let me copy this one, and I'll save this as lightbg.svg. Throw the codes in there. And now I want to set these as the actual background image. So over in our layout on our main element here, we can set a background URL, and it's going to be dynamic because I want to specify the URL specifically to be that image. So inside of here, I can say URL, And then because I put those SVGs in the public folder, they're always just going to be served from the root. So here I'll say lightbg.svg, and let's save that. Cool. So let's go to light mode so we can see what this looks like. So by default, you can see down there at the bottom, it's repeating. It's really just set to the top left corner. So first, if we do bg cover, that should cover the page instead of repeating it. Awesome. And then we'll do bg repeat. And then let's actually see what this looks like if the content of the page has some scroll to it. So if we go to our main page, for now, I'm just going to add some fixed height on this. So I'll do height and let's do 2000 pixels. So let's see what happens here. So yeah, you can see that it like blows up the image. I don't want that. So first of all, if I set overflow to auto, that should fix the scroll in the x-axis. Yeah, so now it only scrolls in the y-axis. Awesome. And that looks good to me. If I zoom way out, the background still looks fine. If I zoom way in, the background still looks good. Yeah, so this is pretty much what I want. So now I can specify what the background image should be whenever we're in dark mode, because right now it's always going to be that same SVG. Within Tailwind, you can use the dark selector. And we'll say that when we're in dark mode, basically I want to change the URL to be that dark background. So we'll set that here, dark BG. And now when I go into dark mode, it changes the background image. Sweet. One last little bit of cleanup. Let's remove this massive height on this div and also give it a little bit of margin on top. So if we head back over to the page, let's remove that height and then just set a margin top of 4. Nice. We have a wonderful landing page that looks good in dark mode and light mode. Sweet. Now, one of the last things I want to do here is set up an error page, because right now the error page is just the built-in one. So you can see if I go to the profile page, it's not found. And if we look at it in light mode, it doesn't look that great because it's just using these default styles. So let's set up a not found page. So in Next.js, there's a convention. If you create a file called not-found, this will be used if there's ever a 404 and that page can't be found. So here I'll just export a component and I am going to just use a card from NextUI. We'll throw in a card body, and then inside of here, I'll have a paragraph tag that says this page cannot be found, like that. Let's set up some styles. Let's just give it a max width. Let's do medium, and then an automatic margin like so. Now that we have that file, it actually uses this error page. Let's adjust the styles a little bit. Let me set it to text center, and then I'll also increase the font size here. Let's just do text 2XL like that. Cool, that looks better. And then we want a little bit of margin on top. So I'm gonna do a margin top of 4. Nice. And so now if we ever come across a page that isn't found, we're gonna get that custom error message. And when we're in light mode, it's still using our styles. One more thing is I wanna add a little icon there. So within tabular icons, there is an icon called file unknown or something like that. Let's just search for icon unknown. Yeah, icon file unknown. Let's throw that in there. Nice. But let's just center everything so that way the icon is right next to the text. So if I make this a flexbox and then do items center that, and then also justify center like that, great, but that means we actually don't need text center anymore. And then I can add a gap of 2, so there's a little separation between the icon and the text. Awesome. So that looks good in light mode and dark mode. Great. Now, in the next part of this video, I'm going to be setting up environment variables and also authentication. But if you'd like to just use the NextUI starter that I've created here, this is going to be on a branch called NextUI in the starter kit repo that is linked in the description. Next up, I'm going to set up working with environment variables in a type-safe way. So by default, Next.js will detect your .env files and load them in so you can access them from process.env. But it's possible that you might be missing an environment variable, or sometimes you want some environment variables to be numbers, like when you're dealing with ports. And for that, we can use something like Zod. So Zod is a schema validator, and essentially we can use it to read in the env and then work with it in a type-safe way. Now, you could use Zod directly, but there is this package called T3env. This is built on top of Zod, but it has some nice things built in so that when you're working inside of Next.js, you do things in the right way, because especially if you're dealing with environment variables on the client, you actually need to include each one of those public environment variables. Otherwise, it won't get included in the build. And there's some nice built-in type safety here that ensures that you do that. So let's get it set up. We're going to run this command to add it. And then from there, I'm going to create a server env file. Now, it's possible to have a single file that specifies both your client and your server, but I like to have 2 separate files and make it so that my server environment variables can only be imported by files that are going to be running on the server. So in my source codes, I'm going to create a directory called env. And then inside of there, I'll create a file called server.ts. and then we can copy their example here. Now, when this code is running on the server, as long as you're using a version of Next.js greater than 13.4.4, you don't have to specify every single one of your environment variables. You can just pull those in dynamically from process.env. So that will work for us. Now, for now, we're just going to have an environment variable called node-env, and this will be an enum that is either development or production. And if you check out the T3env docs, they actually have a setting that says throw an error if the environment variables are empty, because it's possible that you could specify an environment variable but just set it to nothing, but we actually want to throw an error even if it's empty. So if you check out customization, there is a setting here called empty strings as undefined. And we're going to set that to true. So that way, even if it's specified in the env, if it's empty, we still want to throw an error to make sure that we set that before our application starts up. And so now to actually validate our env whenever the app starts up, we are going to modify our next config. So inside of here, we can pull in our env, that'll run the Zod validator. And if there are any missing environment variables, the application will not start at all. And this is a good default to have, because if there are any missing environment variables in production, you won't even have to track that down. Literally, the application will not start unless those environment variables are set. So if we look in their docs here, they mention we can use this package called Jitty, because essentially this file is a JavaScript file. It's not a TypeScript file, but we want to be able to import in this TypeScript file whenever the application is starting up. So Jitty just does a just-in-time transpilation of that file so it can actually run even though it's running inside of a JavaScript file. So we need to add Jitty. Great. And now inside of our next config, we can run these codes. So up at the top here, I'm going to throw that in, but we want to pull this in from source/env/server.ts. We'll save that. If we kill our server and then restart, the app starts up just fine. That's good. But let's actually take a look at what got parsed here. So if we log out this env value when the app starts up, we can see that node env is set to development. So by default, when you're running in dev mode, it's already set to development. So the env was parsed, everything was good to go. But let's actually try adding another value here, and it should crash because that value doesn't exist in our .env. So let's just do a database URL and set that to a string like that. And now if we restart our application, it immediately crashes and says we have invalid environment variables. The database URL is required. And so now we must specify that in our .env. So if I go over, specify a .env.local file, inside of here, I can set database URL to, let's just set it to something for now. And if we do that, we should be able to start up our application because it's able to read in that database URL. But we are using Zod, so we actually can even do further validations, right? So inside of Zod on strings, you can actually specify that it's a URL. And if we do this, now when we start up our application, we can see that database URL is an invalid URL. So this is really great, especially if you're working on a team and you're trying to onboard someone. They won't even be able to start the application until they can get all of those environment variables set. So for now, I'm actually just going to remove this extra value here. And once we start setting up all of our other libraries for auth and our database and everything, we'll gradually add more values here. So I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of everything in here. And now we'll be good to go for any library that needs an environment variable. Now, another thing I want to do is instead of spitting out this giant error here, I kind of want to just clean this up and only show that there were invalid environment variables. And so within T3env, there is an option to customize what happens when there is a validation error. So we are going to grab this, throw it in here. We'll import Zod error from Zod. But now instead of throwing an error, we're actually just going to exit. So if I do process.exit with an exit code of 1, now it's not going to log out that whole error, but it'll still stop the app from starting if there were any invalid environment variables. So now if I run this, you'll see it says invalid environment variables, and it's a bit easier to parse. We don't have to scroll through the whole stack trace there. Awesome. So let's just make this a valid database URL real quick so the app actually starts up. Now if we start it up, we're good to go. Now let me remove this console log. And now that we have this way of accessing environment variables in a type-safe way, I actually want to prevent anyone from using process.env directly. So let me show you what I mean. Let's say we're inside of a component like this page.tsx here. And let's just say we try to access one of our environment variables. And so in this case, I'm just going to log out process.env.database URL. Now I want to prevent any piece of code from directly using process.env except for my actual env parsing file. And so I want to see a linter error here and make it so that anywhere in my code base, the only way to access the env is to import that parsed and validated env file. And for that, there's this plugin for ESLint called eslint-plugin-check-file that includes a bunch of extra rules that you can enable inside of your app. So let's install this as a development dependency. So we'll do pnpm add -d eslint-plugin-check-file. And now inside of my ESLint RC, we can enable this rule. So first of all, we're going to add in to the list of plugins. So I'll add in, and then the rule we want to enable is called no process env. So I can do in/no process env, and we're going to set that to error. And now if we take a look back at page, you can see that we get a linter error. So unexpected use of process.env. And so this is great because now anywhere in my code, if someone, maybe they're not familiar with my code base, they try to use process.env, they're going to get a linter error. And so in order to fix this, we actually should use env directly. So I need to import env server, and that works just fine. But over here in my server file, I do have a linter error, but this is going to be the one place that we are able to use process.env. So we're actually going to just disable that rule for this one line because this should be the only place in my application where I actually use process.env. Okay, so I'm going to remove all of this stuff that has to do with database URL. We're going to set that up later because there's going to be more that's involved. We just use that as an example. But let me clean all of this up. And in the next part of this video, we're going to actually set up our database and auth and everything else. Next up, we're going to set up authentication. And there's a lot of ways to go about this. If you look in the Next.js documentation, they actually have an entire article on setting up auth with sessions from scratch. So you can definitely check that out. And Lee has actually done a video walking through this process and talking about all the concepts involved with auth. Honestly, if you're brand new to auth, I highly recommend checking this out and also going through this article because it explains everything you would need to know about auth. But you don't always want to implement it from scratch. So there are solutions out there where you don't have to implement it from scratch. And specifically, there is next-auth. Now, in the world of Next.js, next-auth is probably the most popular package for implementing authentication. And this is what we're going to use in this starter kit. Now, we're going to use version 4, which is technically the older version of next-auth because the team is gradually working on a thing called Auth.js. And this is essentially next-auth recreated to work with many different backend frameworks, not just Next.js. However, it's still experimental, and right now the v5 is in beta, so we're going to stick to v4 and use the next-auth package. There's also a library called Lucia, and they have documentation on how to set this up with Next.js as well. Now, you could use a hosted service for authentication, and these are great, especially if you have a smaller app or you're just getting started, because they have a lot of extra stuff built in, like password reset emails and being able to do like one-click email logins without having to set up your own email provider. They also have like user management, so they're pretty nice, but they typically start to charge more as you get more active users. So I typically try to avoid services like that because next-auth or libraries like Lucia are usually all that I need for the kinds of applications that I'm building. And because these libraries integrate with just a various amount of databases, you can pretty much store your users wherever you're already storing the rest of your data as well, which is one thing I really like. So let's get this thing set up. So if we head over to the documentation and then the getting started section here on next-auth, we can install the next-auth package. And then from there, we need to set up an API route. And since we're using the app router, we can actually use route handlers. So if you look at the section here, it talks about how we can specifically export a get function and a post function from next-auth. So this is what we're going to do. So we need to create this directory here inside an API folder inside of our app directory. So in here, I'll create a new folder, throw that in there. So now we have app, API, auth, and then a dynamic route segment. So within Next.js, this essentially will allow any request that's coming to API/auth to go to this specific handler. And inside of there, we need a file called route.ts. So I'll call this route. And within that file, we can export the handlers like so. Now, next-auth takes in some configuration options, but I'm actually going to define this in a separate file because we potentially need it in multiple places. So I'm going to pull this out. Things are broken for now, but inside of my source directory, I'm going to create a directory called config. And inside of there, I'm going to create a file called auth.ts. And this file will export the options that we can then pass into the next-auth handler. And so for my application, I'm actually just going to have login with Google. I'm not going to do username, password, or anything like that. It's just going to be OAuth with Google. A user will click, get redirected to Google, choose their account, get redirected back to my app. So if you take a look at the providers section, you can see all of the OAuth providers that they have built in. And we specifically are going to pull in the Google one. So our settings are going to look like this. I'll throw this in here, and this is going to be in an object called options. It's an object. It looks like this. And in order to get some type checking here, we can specify the type of options to be next-auth options like that. And then we'll export options as the default export. So export default options like that. Now we need to set up our Google Client ID and our Google Client secret. So we're going to add these inside of our server env. So over here, I'm going to throw these in and say that they both need to be a string like that. And now I'll have to specify these inside of my env.local file. Great. Now to get these values, I'll need to create an OAuth client in the Google console. Now within the Google console, I'm going to create a project. I'll just call this the Next.js Starter. And then from the dashboard under APIs and services, we can go to the credentials section. Now within here, we'll create some credentials. We'll choose OAuth client ID, and we'll have to configure the consent screen. And so this is the screen that people see whenever they're logging in with your app. So this is an external app. I'll fill out all of these settings, grab my client ID and secret, and then we'll head back over to my app. And when we're setting up scopes, we want to make sure to choose that we can view the user's email address and then also open ID. So these are the minimum scopes needed whenever we're using OAuth. If you're integrating with Google services and like using the user's info and access token to do things on their behalf, you'll have to choose other scopes as well. But these are the minimum scopes that we'll need. Now, before you can actually push any of this to production, you actually have to get it approved. And so you're going to want to have test users. And so I'm just going to add some other accounts here so that way I'm able to test it without being logged into this specific account. And so now that we've set that up, we actually can create some client credentials now. So I'll choose OAuth client ID, and we're going to choose that this is a web application, and I'll give it a name of Next.js Starter. And so if you take a look in the Next.js documentation, you can see that this is what our callback URL will be. So I'm just going to throw that inside of here. Now, right now I'm just running in development, so this is fine. But once you deploy your application, you'll need to make sure that you add the redirect URI with your deployed domain as well. So I'll create this, and now I can copy my client ID and client secret into my env file. And now with those values set in my .env.local file, those should be loaded in, and I can actually pull them into my auth options. So now instead of pulling these from process.env, I'm just going to pull them in from env, and we'll import that there. And so now it has those specific values. Now I need to pass these options into my next-auth handler. So if we head back over here, we can pull in our options that get imported from config auth. Now we're getting a linter error because of the kebab-case rule that we set up. So let's see if we can actually disable that rule whenever we have a dynamic route path. Because when we're setting up API routes, we might need to use dynamic and have like the square brackets. So let's update that rule in our ESLint-RC. So here, if I say not something that starts with a square bracket followed by anything else, let's see. Yeah, so that fixes the rule here. So this should be good to go. We've created our handler. We're passing in the options. And then those options are specifying that we're using the Google provider. Now, by default, next-auth actually doesn't require a database. It can do everything in memory and store the sessions inside of JSON web tokens. So this actually is ready to go to test to see if we can get logged in. So for that, let's add an auth button in our navbar. So if we head to the components folder, and we can add an auth button here. Now, because the auth button is only ever going to be used by the navbar, and also the theme switcher is only ever used in the navbar, I'm going to restructure things here so that I have a folder called app navbar, and then everything related to the navbar is going to live inside of there. So, and yeah, we'll update our imports. We'll push this into there, and we'll actually rename this to index.tsx. And so when you're working in a larger code base and you have more and more components, if a component is only ever used in like one specific spot, I like to group those together inside of a folder. That way it's not crowding up the components folder. So this should be good. Let me just double check my layout to see that, yes, we've got that. The import is broken, but if I reload VS Code, loading, okay, it can find it now. Awesome. So now that we have that folder inside of there, I'm going to create a component called auth button. We'll export a function, and for now, we'll just return a button that says sign in. and we're going to pull this in from NextUI. I'm going to set the color to danger because it's red and Google's colors are red. I'm going to set the variant to ghost. And then now let's bring this button into the navbar. So here in the navbar, I want to show that auth button right after the theme switcher. So we'll add another navbar item and then pull in the auth button like that. And so now we have a nice little sign in button. Sweet. And then of course we want to have that in our collapsed menu as well. So I'm going to throw this at the very bottom, and this will be a navbar menu item like that. And so now whenever this is collapsed, we should see that sign in button there. Cool. So when this button is clicked, we want to log in with Google OAuth, and there's a built-in sign in function that comes from next-auth. So let's set that up. On click, we're going to run the sign in function. So we can import that from next-auth React, and then we can pass in the provider that we want to log in with, in this case, which is Google, just like that. So now when I click the button, it should redirect us to Google. The user will consent and then redirect us back to the app. But let's actually detect if the user is logged in. So next-auth also provides a hook called useSession, and here we can grab the data, which is the session data, and then also the status, which is if it's loading or if we're authenticated or not. Now, in order to use this hook, this actually does need to be a client component. So we're going to say use client here. And then lastly, to be able to use this hook, we actually need to be inside of the session provider. So yeah, we're getting an error right now that says the use session should be wrapped in a session provider. So if we head over to our providers component, we can actually wrap all of this in the session provider. So we'll add the session provider here, which comes from next-auth React, and then move all of this inside of there. Awesome. And so now it's not complaining anymore. It has access to that use session value. So now let's handle what happens if the user is logged in or if it's loading. So here we'll say if status is equal to loading, we're actually just going to show a circular progress. And so there is a component called circular progress built into NextUI React. So we'll add that there. And so if it's loading, we'll show that. And then if the status is authenticated, that means we're signed in. So we actually want to show a sign out button. So here, copy this button, but instead of sign in, it'll be sign out. And when you click it, we'll call sign out, which comes from next-auth React like that. And let's not forget a return here. So if we are authenticated, show the sign out button. If we're not, show the sign in button. Okay, moment of truth. I'm going to click sign in. We get redirected, which is great. I'll click my user account, and then we get redirected back and it says sign out. Sweet. So we have that information about the user. Now let's add a little drop-down menu that like shows the user avatar and has like a sign out option under their avatar. And also let's show a Google icon on the button here. So right here, we're going to add icon Google, icon brand Google. Throw that here, throw that here. That looks good. And whenever we are in the collapsed menu, I actually do want it to just be this button. So I'm going to add an option to this component called minimal. So if it's minimal, just show the button, but otherwise we're going to have like an avatar with a drop down in a menu and stuff like that. So this component will take in minimal option, and this is just going to be a Boolean, and we're going to default this to true. And so if we're authenticated, then if we are minimal, we're going to return this button. But if we're not, we're going to return a nice little drop-down menu. Okay, so this should still work. But now let's take a look at the NextUI docs and find how we can do like a drop-down. So if we take a look, they do have a drop-down component, which looks like this, but they also have a section called custom trigger. So you can actually make it so that an avatar triggers a menu. And this is basically what we want. We want to show the user's image up in the top right. And then when we click, we'll have a menu that has like sign out inside of it. And I just want the first example. I don't want to have the text beside it. So we'll grab this first drop down all the way up to here and let's use it. So if this auth button is not minimal, then we're going to return this drop down. Let me import all of these things. I'll import all of those. And for now, we're just going to have one option here, which is sign out, with a key of sign out, and we'll set an on click here. So when this is clicked, we want to run sign out. And now we can specify the user's email. So we pulled in data from use session. We should have our email on it. So let's specify that here. So we're going to grab data.user.email. And then now on this avatar component, we will specify the user's image. So right here, let's specify data.user.image, like so. And then the avatar component in NextUI has a fallback option. So we'll set show fallback to be if data.user.image is not defined. Otherwise, this will just be empty string. Okay, let's see what we get. But when we're in the main navbar, I don't want this to be the minimal one. So if we head back over to the navbar, we can see that we're actually missing the minimal prop. Let's set minimal to be optional. It's optional, but it defaults to true. So now when it's in the collapsed menu, it'll be minimal, but now when it's in the navbar, we're gonna set minimal to false. And we should see our avatar. Sweet. And so now we have a little avatar with a dropdown. We can see who we're signed in as, and then we can click sign out. That signs us out. Sweet. We can sign back in. And if we're in the collapsed menu, we can see the sign out button there as well. Awesome. Now, one last thing, let's set it up so that the profile page actually shows the user info, and we don't show this profile link unless the user is actually logged in. So within the app directory, I'm going to create a folder called profile, and then inside of there, we'll create a page.tsx. And we'll export a component. And so when we're in a server component, we can get access to the session with a function called get server session that comes from next-auth, and we should pass in our auth options. So this is why I defined it in a separate file, is now I can import those auth options there and pass them directly into get server session. And so now I can grab the session by calling this. We'll make this an async component. And now I can use that session data to display the user info. So for now, let's actually just return the JSON data of the session. So I'm just going to do JSON.stringify of session. And let's see what we get. So if we head to the profile page, we can see that it is null. And I actually forgot to do one thing. So if we look at the errors here, we can see a warning that says we have no auth URL and no secret. So let's actually set this up. So here in the docs, you can see that it's just your base domain. And so let's set this up in our env and then also our env local file. So here we're going to say that next-auth URL needs to be a string and it is a URL. Like so. And then the other thing we need is the next-auth secret. And so this is what's used to encrypt the JSON web token. And this is going to be a string. So we'll set this to z.string. And then now we can specify these inside of our env.local. Now, I'm not going to show you this because it has my client ID and secret, but next-auth URL is just going to be localhost 3000. And then I'll show you how we can generate a secret. So you can see in the next docs, there's a command you can run with OpenSSL that'll just generate a random value. This is what you can use as the secret. So from the terminal, if we run this, we just get a long value, and this is what I'm going to set as my secret in my .env file. So now that I have those values set, let's restart my server and reload the page here. Great. So the session was created before I had the secret. So let's actually sign out and then sign back in. So let's sign in. There we go. So now we have the user value there. We can actually display their info on this profile page. So on the profile page, I'm just going to return a card with a card body. And NextUI has a component called the user component that will just display right there on this card. So let's grab this code. I'm going to put it inside the card. And the name here will be session.user.name. Our description we'll just set as the email, and we can specify the avatar props here. So this will be session.user.image. And if that isn't defined, just the empty string. And similar to how we set up that drop-down button in the navbar, we can also set the show fallback option to be session.user.image. If that is not defined, then we should show the fallback image. Okay, so just like that, if we head to the profile, we now have the user info there in a profile card. So let's set a max width on the card here, set it to medium, and then we'll give it some automatic margin in the x-axis and a margin top of 4. Cool. So there's a little user card there. Obviously, in a real world application, we might show more info about the user profile. Okay. One thing I want to do is if the user is not logged in, they shouldn't be able to go to the profile and they shouldn't see the profile link in the navbar here. So if we sign out, we can see, we just see like this fallback, but I don't want the user to be able to go to this profile page at all. So first of all, let's update our sign in and sign out functions. So if we head to the auth button, we can specify where we should send the user when they're done logging in or when they're done logging out. So when a user logs in, I want them to be redirected to the profile page. So here we can specify a callback URL, and I'm going to specify that as /profile. So when you log in, after the login is done, go to the profile page. And when you log out, I want to go back to the home page. So I'll specify that in our sign out function. So this also takes a callback URL, and we're just going to go to the index. And we actually have two methods that are calling sign out. I'm going to actually define this in a function so we can reuse it. Let's actually pull this out to like sign out click, and then we'll define a function called sign out click that's equal to that. And we can pass this same function into this other button like so. Okay, so now when a user signs in, it should redirect them to the profile. And when a user signs out, it should redirect them to the home page. Awesome. That's the behavior that we want. But the other thing is in the navbar, we don't want to show the profile link if the user is not logged in. So within the navbar, we can also use the session and not display that item if they're not logged in. So let's grab the session, and we're just going to use the status. So if the status is authenticated, we're going to push this profile link into the navbar. So we'll say if status is equal to authenticated, then we'll say menu items.push. We're going to push in this object, but it won't be in there by default, like that. So now if the user isn't logged in, we do not see a profile link. This also should work inside of our collapsed menu because it's using that same array. But if the user is logged in, then they should see that profile link. Awesome. So this looks good. Now, the one thing is, even if they can't see that link, they can still go to it. So watch this. If I sign out, even though I can't see that profile link, technically I can still go to /profile, and we don't want that. So to prevent this, we're actually going to use a middleware. So within next-auth, they have a built-in middleware that we can use and just specify which routes should be protected by authentication. So I'll grab this code here, and then we need a middleware file. So in our application, the middleware.ts file needs to live right next to the app folder. It can't be inside the app folder, so we're going to put it in the source directory. I'll create a file called middleware.ts and then throw this inside of here, but we actually want to protect /profile like so. So now if someone tries to go to /profile, if they are not logged in, they'll get redirected to the default not logged in page. And yeah, this looks good here. Let's see what happens. So let's try refreshing this page. Boom, you can see that next-auth actually redirects us back to this like a standard login page, which is great. We can actually change where the user gets redirected to if they are not logged in and that middleware kicks in. So if you take a look in the next-auth documentation and then look in configuration and pages, you can see that we can specify where they should go if there was an error or where they should go to sign in or sign out. And so I'm actually going to override the sign in page because that's where we're getting redirected to. So if we go to /profile, you can see that it's taking us to API auth sign in. And because next-auth supports a lot of different sign-in methods like email password and OAuth and just email magic links, this page is nice because if you set all of that up, it's going to automatically show all of those sign-in options. But if you want more control, you can just send them to your own page. And so I'm actually just going to send them to the home page and display that error there. So here I'm going to say sign in is just on the home page because that sign in button is always in the navbar. And so now if I try to go to /profile, I just get redirected back to the home page. And this is good enough for now. Of course, you can modify this further. You can define custom pages for each one of these options, but for this simple app, this should be fine. Now, one more thing we should do is actually set up a suspense boundary because this code here is running on the server and it loads pretty quickly, but what if it doesn't? And let's actually emulate what happens if this is a really long request. So I'm just going to await a promise. 2 seconds like this. Okay, so let's see what happens if we try to visit the profile page and for whatever reason, like getting the session or reading from the database or something like that is taking a really long time. So first of all, let's sign in. And I think we saw it happen, but let's actually try it in a brand new tab. So if in a brand new tab, if I try to go to /profile, you can see that we're literally waiting that entire time before we see the page itself. And Next.js has a way of handling this using a suspense boundary. So if we go to our layout here, if we add a suspense boundary around our children, this is where the page is getting rendered, and the shell of the application can actually load first before showing the rendered page. So if we wrap this in suspense, like so, now you can see the overall shell of the page loads, and then we're kind of just waiting for the rest of the page to load. So let's start it in a blank tab. You can see that it loads, and then finally it kicks in. And so to augment this, we can also set up what should be displayed if we're loading an async component. So inside of here, we're going to set up a loading.tsx file. And essentially, this is what will show if some asynchronous component is in the process of loading. And so here, I'm just going to return a circular progress element. Of course, we'll give it an aria label. And I'm going to just put this in the center with margin X auto. So now you can see if there's some long running process, we actually see that loading indicator before the page itself loads. Awesome. Now I want that loading indicator to be even bigger and much more apparent. So if we take a look in the NextUI docs, you can see under custom styles, we can actually specify how large that circular progress could be. So let's pass in the width and height to the class names here. So we can specify this. Let's see what we get. Nice. So now that's a nice big loading indicator before it shows the page. Now, before I forget, let's actually just remove that timeout of 2 seconds. And we can see that things are pretty instant. But once we start getting a database involved and everything else, we definitely will need that suspense boundary for other async pages. Now, so far, we don't have a database. So this user actually isn't getting stored anywhere. It's literally just in the session cookie. But in the real world, we actually want to put these users inside of a database so we can actually start associating data with them and everything else. So in the next part of this video, I'm going to get our database set up with Drizzle. And then after that, we can look at database adapters here inside of next-auth and get it connected up to our Drizzle database. Now let's set up our database. Now there are a lot of options for this. These days, it kind of seems like people are basically choosing between an ORM called Drizzle and one called Prisma. But there are other options. There's also this thing called micro ORM, and there is a package called Lucid, which actually comes from the creators of Adonis.js. And all of these are ORMs, except for Drizzle, which also has like a query building syntax. But there are other packages that people like to use as well, such as Keysly. So Keysly is a query builder in that you write kind of like these chained methods that ultimately get turned into SQL queries, but they don't have the higher level way of defining like models that correspond to your database. And then of course there's Connects, which has probably been around the longest, but doesn't have the greatest TypeScript support. Now, Drizzle popped up because there were actually a lot of issues with attempting to run Prisma inside of serverless environments or like memory constrained environments. Now, more recently, Prisma has actually fixed a lot of those issues, so it works pretty well even in serverless environments. But one of the things that I really like about Drizzle is there is no code generation step. So essentially, the code you write to define a specific table is the exact same code you use to correspond to the type of the data inside of that table. So there's no generation step. Whereas with Prisma, you define your schema inside of a Prisma file, and then anytime your Prisma file changes, you have to run generate, which actually generates TypeScript code, which is fine, especially if your database isn't changing as often. But I really like Drizzle's tight integration with TypeScript in that there's no generation step. Basically, I can define my table and then I have a type that I can instantly use that corresponds to that table. And there are really cool built-in helpers that can basically take that same table definition and instantly turn it into a Zod validator, again, with no generation step. There are similar tools that exist in the Prisma ecosystem, but again, there's a generation step. So anytime your schema changes, it would need to regenerate those Zod validators. But that's why I've decided to use Drizzle in this starter kit. So let's set it up. Now, one of the interesting things about Drizzle is they actually have different connectors depending on the type of database that you're connecting to. So they support both Postgres, MySQL, and SQLite. But for each one of those, there's a lot of different ways that you could be connecting to one of those databases. Specifically, I'm going to be using Postgres, and we're going to be using the Postgres.js client. So locally, when I set everything up, we're going to be connecting to a Postgres database that lives inside of a Docker container. So this driver will work. But when we deploy, we might need to choose a different adapter like Neon or Vercel Postgres. And when we come to that point, we could potentially write code that chooses the correct connector depending on where the code is running. But locally, I'm going to go ahead and set this up for Postgres.js. So we'll run these install commands, and then we'll create a file, which is our connection to the database. So I'm going to create a folder in source called db. And inside of there, I'll create my index.ts. and we'll define this codes inside of here. Now, I specifically just want to export my drizzle connection from this file. So I'm going to get rid of all this stuff that has to do with migration, and we're going to set that up in a separate file. And so with this, I'm just going to export that DB as default. Now let's set up some environment variables. So you can see by default, it's just passing in a string here. We want this to actually come from our env. So if we head over to our server env, there's a few things that we're going to need here. Now we will have a database URL environment variable, but because I'm going to be using Docker and I want these settings to sync between them, I'm actually going to have a separate environment variable for every part of the connection string. So first up, we need the DB host, and this will be a string. Then we're also going to need the DB user. This will also be a string. Of course, we need the DB password. This will also be a string. Then we need the database name. We'll need the port. And port should always be a number, so we can actually do a z.coerce and then use number. So in our env, the port is actually defined as a string, but whenever we parse it, we're going to turn that into a number. And then lastly, we want the overall database URL. So it'll just be a string, and we can also make sure that it's a valid URL. Now let's define these inside of our env.local file. And because we're going to be using Docker, all of this is going to be running on localhost. So I'll set db host to localhost. The user, I'm just going to set to next starter, and the password I'm going to set to super secret, and the DB name I'll set to next starter, and the port will be the default port 5432. Now, the database URL is essentially a combination of all of these other variables, and so we can actually use environment variable expansion to combine all of those together. So the database URL is PostgreSQL:// user, password, host, port, and then database name. Now that we have these environment variables, let's set up a database running inside of Docker. Now, if you're new to Docker, definitely check out the crash course video that I have here on the Syntax channel. I dive deep into what Docker is, how to set up compose files, how to build your own images. So if you want to learn more about Docker, definitely check that video out. I'm going to show you the basics for getting a Postgres database up and running, and it's actually pretty simple. So if you check out Docker Hub, they have an image available for Postgres, and then they have a command we can run to just start a Postgres database. But I don't want to have to run this command every time I need the database, so I'm going to define what's called a compose file. So within my repo here, I'm going to define a file called docker-compose.yml. And inside of here, I can define my various services. And our only service right now is just going to be DB, and I'll give it the name DB, and then I can specify the image. Here, the image is going to be Postgres. This image name comes from Docker Hub here. Now, if you do this, it's always going to be the latest version, but let's lock it down to the latest stable version, which is 16.4. So I'm going to say :16.4. Now you can see in their command here, there are some environment variables that we can pass in, like Postgres password. And we essentially want to use the values that we defined in our own env file and pass those in here. So within our Docker compose, there's a section called environments. And here we can specify each of those. So I want my Postgres password to be equal to the DB password that I set inside of my env. And then we also need to set up the user and the DB name. And if we look in their documentation here, we can see they have some other environment variables available to us, like Postgres user. So I'm going to set Postgres user equal to DB user. And lastly, we need the database name. And so this will be Postgres DB. So here we'll say Postgres DB is DB name. Now, by default, if I spin this up, there will be no way to connect to it. So essentially what I want to do is I want to map the port of the database running inside that container to my local machine. So right here, we can specify ports, and I can say map the port that I specified in my env to 5432 running inside the container. So if on my local machine, for whatever reason, like port 5432 is taken, technically I could go into my env here and change this to something else, and I'd still be able to connect it to my database. Now, the last thing we want to do here is make sure there is some persistence, because every time we spin up and spin down a container, all of the data is lost unless we specifically put it inside of a volume. So if we look in their docs, they tell us where the data inside the container is stored, and we want to map that to a folder on our machine. So right here, I'm going to specify volumes, and we'll pass this value in here, and I'll just specify a folder inside this current directory. So I'm going to do docker data/db, and essentially all of the data associated with that Postgres database is going to be stored on my local machine. So if I ever get rid of that image or delete it, whenever I spin it back up, I'm going to have that persistent data because it's going to map it back to the folder inside of this repo. Now, I would never want to push this up to Git or anything like that. So I want to make sure that Docker data is inside of my git ignore. So if we head over to our git ignore, just make sure we throw this in here so we're not accidentally committing all of that Postgres data to our Git repo. So there's one issue. I accidentally said environments instead of environment. And then the other thing is Docker actually doesn't look for .env.local. It just looks for a .env file. So we could point it to .env.local, but I'm actually just going to rename my local env file to .env because Next.js should still pick that up, but now Docker will pick that up automatically. And so with that, if I run docker compose up, it should see that env file, load those environment variables, pull the Postgres image, and start it up. Awesome. So I have a Postgres database running on my machine, and my app is ready to connect to it. And so now here inside of my Drizzle client, instead of passing in a hard-coded string, we should be able to pull in our env and then pass in database URL. And now to see if this is working, if it can actually connect to my Docker container that's running, let's just import this file into my homepage. So to test this out, I'm just going to do a simple query that lists all the information in the PG catalog PG tables. But if it can't connect to the database, this will error out. And if it can, we should at least see some info printed out here. So let's try it out. If I refresh the homepage, there we go. It was able to spit out some info, which is great. So yeah, there's all that internal information. Now, if it wasn't able to connect to the database, we should see an error. So let's actually do this. If I kill the Docker container and then refresh the page here, we get an actual error that was thrown that deals with the fact that it couldn't connect to the database. Let's start the Docker container back up. And then if we refresh the page again, good to go. So now let's actually define our own tables and schema and then get that run against the database. So for this, I'm actually going to use the schema that's provided for us by next-auth. That gives us basically our users table and our accounts and our sessions table, and then we'll modify it slightly. So if we look in the next-auth docs, take a look at the Postgres schema, this is going to be what we need. Ultimately, I really just want the tables here, and I'm going to show you how we can actually define these in separate files and make it a little bit more maintainable when we have a bunch of tables in our database. So I'm just going to grab these table definitions, and then in the folder here inside of DB, I'm going to create a folder called schema. And the way I like to set it up is to have an individual file for every table. Sometimes if the tables are related, I'll maybe put those in the same file. But as my database grows, I don't like having all of those tables defined in a single file. So let's actually just start with the users table. So if I create a file here called users.ts, let's actually throw all of that table definitions in there and then get rid of everything except for the user definition. Now I need to import all of this stuff from PG Core, and then we can import these from PG Core as well. Now you can see the schema that they provided for us is actually using a text data type for the ID column, and then they're using the crypto function here to generate a UUID. Postgres actually includes the ability to generate UUID, so I want to do this inside of the database instead of inside of application code. So instead of making this text, I'm going to use UUID. And you can see that we can import that in from PG Core. And so now this column type is going to be UUID. And now the default function here, instead of calling crypto.random UUID, we can actually call the internal Postgres function. And let's find that in the Drizzle docs. So here in the docs, you can see some examples where they're using that UUID type. And there actually is a built-in function called .defaultRandom that comes off of UUID that under the hood is going to call genRandom UUID, which is a built-in Postgres function. So instead of calling that, we can just say default random like so. Now it's going to be a UUID, and the database will handle automatically generating that whenever a new row is inserted for a user. Now, we could use text for the name and the email, but I'm actually going to use varchar, so that way we can limit the length here. And so for name, we'll use varchar, which comes from PG Core. And this is the one issue you might run into when you're using Drizzle, is because all of these things are defined in separate libraries, make sure you're importing from PG Core and not MySQL Core. So we want varchar, and then here we can specify the max length, and I'm just going to set this to 255. And then for the email, we'll set this to varchar as well. And then I actually looked up what is the maximum length of an email. I came across this Stack Overflow post. It talks about 254 characters. Some people are mentioning use 320. Then there's like this RFC, but I will set this to 320. The other thing is I'm going to add a constraint on the email that says it cannot be null as well. And then we'll bring timestamp in from PG core. And then I'm also going to set this as not null. And then lastly, we have our image. So I'll also set this to a varchar. And then let's look up what the longest possible URL could be. So there's not a straightforward answer, but it seems like search engines like URLs less than 2048, and certain older browsers might have a limitation of like 2083. So we're going to go with 2048 as the max length on this URL. And then we're also going to set this to not null. Awesome. So got our basic user table set up, and I'm actually going to export this as the default export. So export default like so. Now we're going to define the rest of the tables as well. But the other thing that I want to do is create an index schema file that exports all of the tables that I define. So I'm going to create an index file in here, and I'm going to say export default as users from that users file there. And so every table I define, I'm going to export it from here. And now I have all of my tables defined in a single place, so I can use this schema in the database connection and also in our drizzle-kit config, which we'll configure in a little bit. And then now let's define our accounts table. So in the schema folder, I'm going to create a file called accounts.ts. Throw this in here. We'll import this from PG core, import this from PG core, and then go through and update this stuff. So user ID, which references users.id, this actually should be a UUID column because that's what we set in the users table. And then I can import the users table inside of this file. So if I import users, this is how we set up forward key references. So we've defined the user ID column, and it's referencing users ID column. And then we need to import adapter account type. That looks like it comes from here, but it's not defined. It's actually adapter account, and we'll use that value here. Now, I'm not sure what the max size of these could be, so we're just going to leave those as text. We'll import integer from PG core, and then everything else looks good. And then down here is where we can define further constraints. And so this is actually defining a compound key where the provider and provider account ID are unique. So for any given user from Google, there can only be one Google user that has one specific Google ID. Great. So now let's actually just export this as default, and then we'll export it from our schema as well. So if we head over to the index, we're going to export default as accounts from the accounts file. And then the last table we need is the sessions table. Now there are these two other tables. They're only needed in certain scenarios, like verification tokens is used if you're using like email magic links. And then authenticators, I think, is a new thing in Auth.js, but we just need the sessions table. So I'm going to grab sessions, and we'll create a file here called sessions.ts. Pull in these imports. We'll import the users table here. But again, because we defined their ID as a UUID, we're going to specify this as a UUID. And then we'll pull in timestamp from PG core. This looks good to me. And then we'll export this as default. Now in our schema file, we will explicitly export the sessions table as well. Great. Now I'd like to take this schema and actually push it to the database. So actually create these tables and their corresponding columns in the Postgres database that I have running inside of Docker. And to do that, we're going to use drizzle-kit. So if we take a look at the drizzle-kit docs, you can see that we can define a drizzle config. So we'll grab this, and then in the root of our project, we're going to create a drizzle.config.ts. Throw this in here, and then I can specify the schema here. So this is going to be in the source directory, in the DB folder, in the schema folder, in a file called index.ts, just like that. And then another option I want to specify is where to put the migration files. And I like everything to live inside of this DB folder. So there's an option called out, and I'm going to specify this as source db/migrations, like this. And then we can specify the database connection with this DB credentials. So I'm going to get rid of this option there, and the URL should be from our env file. So I'm going to pull in env from there, and we'll grab that database URL string. So now I'd like to generate the migration files. So migrations are just SQL files that will be the data definition language for actually creating these tables that we have defined here. Now, some people don't like to have a migrations folder. Some people will typically just use db push, which means write these changes directly to the database. I do like migrations, but ultimately I don't like a lot of migrations. So typically when I'm early in development, I'll be iterating on my database a lot, and I really won't generate a migration until I know the structure of my database is in a stable state. But for now, these are our initial tables, so I'm okay with a migration that defines our initial tables. Once I start actually building out my application, I would want to make sure that I've gotten my tables defined in the right way before I create another migration. But let's try to generate some migrations. So if I do an npx of drizzle kit generate, we do get an error that says the database URL is an invalid URL. My suspicion is that it's not properly expanding the value here, so we might have to bring in a library that does that for us, but let's just log it out. So inside of our env, before we parse it, let's literally log out process.env.database URL. And then if I run this again, you can see that it didn't expand the environment variables here. So to fix that, I'm going to bring in a .env package that will expand those values before actually loading them into our env schema. So for that, we need a library called .env and then another one called .env expand. And now inside of my env file, I'm going to make sure that we run .env expand before actually parsing the env. So here I'll import config from .env, and then we'll import expand from .env expand, like so. And then I can call expand with config, like that. Now let's hope for the best. If I try to generate, this is good. It didn't say invalid URL, but it does say that we need our node env because right now our code is running outside of the context of Next.js. So node env isn't actually set. So let's make sure that we set that in our env. So here I'm just going to set node env to development and then try running generate. Please install the latest version of Drizzle ORM. So I did some debugging. There actually is an open issue over on the Drizzle repo. And what seems to be the issue is I am running npx drizzle kit generate, but this user says if you run npm or pnpm in my case, drizzle kit generate, that will work, which I don't understand why, but that works. And so that actually generates our migration file for us. So if we take a look, this actually generated a folder called migrations. And inside of there, we have a SQL file that defines all of our tables as we define them in our TypeScript schema files. So now that we have a migration SQL file, we actually want to run these against the database. So let's set that up. In our DB folder, let's create a file called migrate.ts. And we can see in their docs that there's a migrate function that we can bring in, and we can actually execute that against the database. So I'm going to copy this code here and paste it. So first up, if I want to use top level await, I have to set target to ES 2017 or higher in our TS config. So let's do that. If we look in the TS config, target isn't actually set. So we can just set this to like ES 2020. That should be compatible with most places that I would choose to deploy this. Okay, awesome. Now I don't actually want to redefine my connection in here. I want to import it in, but you'll notice the one thing is we do want to pass max1 as the option when we're defining our Postgres connection. So I'll do that, but I want to get rid of this, and I want to import db from the other file that we defined it in. So let's just import db from that file there. And you'll see here that it was trying to call the connection.n, so we'll need to export the connection as well. So if we head back over to our main file, we actually want to export the query client as well. And then we need to pass in that max1 option there. But max1 should only be set if we're migrating, so we'll set up an environment variable for that. But now we're exporting the query client, and I'm going to rename this to client. And since we're exporting it, we'll import it in our migrator file, and then we can call client.end there. So we'll import db, and then we'll also import that client. And here we can say client.end. Now, to determine if we are migrating or not, let's create an environment variable that will set only when we're migrating. So if we head over to our env file, and so here we'll create a variable called db migrating, and this needs to be a Boolean. But when we're reading in the env, everything is a string. So if you look at the docs for this library, it has a recipe here for reading in strings and turning them into Booleans. And essentially, we specified that it can only be true or false. And then after that, if it's equal to true, then db migrating will be equal to true. Otherwise, it'll be equal to false. And now when we're creating the connection, we'll look at that value to set the max number of connections. So if we head back over here, we'll set max equal to 1. If env.db migrating is true, then it will be 1. Otherwise, it will be undefined. And so that way we won't set max connections when we're not migrating the database. So that looks good. The other thing is inside of the migrating file, we don't want it to run unless DB migrating is set to true. So let's actually exit early here. So we can say if we are not migrating, and also we'll need to import our env like that. So if we're not migrating, we are just going to throw an error. You must set DB migrating to true. Awesome. So if we're migrating, max connections will be set to 1. We'll then pull that connection in. And the last thing is we want to point to the correct migrations folder. We could hard code it in, but let's actually import it from our drizzle config, right? Because we specify it here. I don't want to define it in multiple places. So right here, I'm going to bring in my drizzle config, and then we can specify config.out like that. Now, config.out can be undefined, but I know that it's not. So I'll just do exclamation mark. So that tells TypeScript that, hey, I know that that's not going to be undefined. So this is looking good. Now let's create a script in our package.json that specifically sets DB migrating to true and then runs this migration file here. So now in our package.json, we can set up a script. I'm going to call this DB migrate. And here we want to set DB migrating to true, and then run drizzle kit migrate like that. So now let's try running this task. So if I say npm run db migrate, it says migrations applied successfully. Awesome. So now if we go back to our homepage where we're listing out the table schema, we should actually see these tables that just got created. But one thing is our env file says that db migrating is required. But in this case, we want it to be optional because it's only ever going to be defined if we're actually running migrations. So in our env, let's actually set this as optional. So I can do z.string, et cetera, dot optional. And so now we should be able to start up the app. Cool. And if we visit the home page, we should see all those tables listed out in the schema. Awesome. So we see drizzle there, we see account, session, and user. So those tables are living within our database. Awesome. Now, one thing we can do is we can also spin up the DrizzleKit Studio, and that'll show us our tables as well. So if I do npm DrizzleKit Studio, that launches it. And if we open it up, we can see that we have an account table, a session table, and a user table. Awesome. So at this point, we now need to link these tables up to next-auth. So it's actually writing data to these tables. And one thing we should do to make sure that this code works on other operating systems as well is we can use a package called crossenv to make sure that like if somebody is running this code on Windows, it's still able to set environment variables there. Because technically this command right here will only run on Linux and Mac. So we're going to install the crossenv package. So I'm going to install as a dev dependency cross-env. And you can see to use it, we just need to specify crossenv before our actual command. So over here, I'll specify crossenv, and that should work just fine. So I can try running those migrations again. And in this case, didn't have any migrations to run, but it was still able to set that environment variable and run the script. So to connect this up to next-auth, we can bring in the drizzle adapter. So let's actually install auth/drizzle adapter. And then now when we're defining our next-auth options, we can pass in the drizzle adapter. So here in our config and then auth, we'll set the adapter as the drizzle adapter. So I'm going to import drizzle adapter from auth drizzle adapter, and then I can import my db from @/db. Now you can see in their docs, if your tables are potentially called something else, you can pass them in here and set which table is which from your schema. But by default, if the tables names are users, accounts, and sessions, they will all hook up automatically whenever you pass in that database connection there. Now we are getting a type error, and this is because we're using the drizzle adapter, which is technically for next-auth version 5. We're still using version 4. So in this case, we're just going to have to ignore this TypeScript error. So I'm going to say ts expect error. And then, of course, we'll have to disable our linter error there. So now next-auth will actually use this database connection to put users into the database and create sessions and different things like that. If we head back over to our app, I'm going to make sure that I delete all of my cookies and everything else, because this was before we're actually storing anything in the database. So let's just delete all my local storage, all my cookies. Do a hard refresh here. Let's also get rid of this query that's in the main page. So if we go to our app and then page.tsx, let's just remove this table query here. Cool. And now let's try signing in. So if I click sign in, it redirects us back to an error. Let's take a look at the console, see what went wrong. Okay, so I found this issue open on next-auth that talks about how, well, by default on the initial insert, it is null, but then it gets updated afterwards. Technically, we can tap into like the profile callback. I'm not going to bother with it. I'm just going to update my schema. So if I head back over to my user table Instead of setting email verified as not null, we'll allow it to be null so that next-auth can do its own thing whenever it's inserting that user. Now, I don't want another migration just to change the field from non-nullable to nullable. So I'm literally just going to delete this migrations folder. And I can also just do a push, which will change the schema in my running database. So let's try that. If I do npm drizzle hit push, so that updates the database to remove that null constraint. And then I'm just going to regenerate those migrations. So if I do npm drizzle hit generate, that should recreate the migrations from scratch. And now I have a migration where the email verified doesn't have that not null constraint. So that should be good. Now let's try logging in again. I'm going to click sign in and it worked. We're actually logged in. You will notice that I didn't get redirected to the profile page, but we need to fix that. And I'll talk about why in a second. But to see the data actually in my database, let's start up DrizzleKit Studio. So if I do npm DrizzleKit Studio, if we take a look, we should have a user in our database. We do. So we have the CJ user here. It has its account set up here, and there is one session in the database here. Awesome. Now, if you remember earlier, we actually set up a middleware that should redirect the user if they are not logged in. And if we take a look at the docs for this middleware, there's one caveat. It only works with the JWT session strategy. And so by default, whenever you add a database adapter, it sets the session strategy to database. And so the built-in middleware is actually not at all compatible with session strategy where it's storing the sessions in a database. Now, I've actually debugged this a ton locally, trying to create like my own middleware function that like pulls in the session, and it's not ideal. And so we have two options. We could make it so that we don't store the sessions in the database. So if you go to your next-auth options here, you can set session, and then there's a strategy option, and you can set this to JWT instead of database. And so if we set that, and then we log in again, you can see that we actually can get to the profile page. But at this point, that just defeats the purpose of even having our sessions table. Because if we clear out this sessions table and then log the user out and then back in, you'll see that with the JWT strategy, we aren't storing sessions in the database at all. So if we refresh over here, yeah, there are no sessions in the database. And I want my sessions to actually be in the database. So here's what we're going to do. I am going to leave the session strategy as database, and I'm going to get rid of the default middleware that we have defined here. Now, I will point you to the docs over on Auth.js that talk about the problem here, where essentially, because these middlewares are running in the edge runtime, they potentially don't have access to the database adapters, and they tell you how you can set it up, but ultimately you do have to set your strategy to JWT. But we don't want that. So what I'm going to do is just create a helper function that will check to see, are we logged in? And if not, we'll redirect the user. And any page that needs to be authenticated is always going to have to call that function at the top of the component. So let's do this. In our source directory, I'm going to create a folder called utils. And inside of there, I'll create a file called require auth. Then we'll export a function. And here we'll use that get server session function that comes from next-auth. We'll pass in our auth options, and we'll grab the session here by awaiting this. We'll have to set this as an async function, and now we can check. So if session.user does not exist, we're going to redirect them. And so we'll pull in redirect from next navigation, and in our case, we're just going to redirect them back to the home page. Otherwise, we just allow the rest of the code to run, so we're not going to return anything or do anything else. And so now any page that needs to make sure a user is authenticated is always going to have to call this as the very first thing in the page so that they get redirected if they're not logged in. And so to see this in action, let's call require auth in our profile page. So if I go to profile here, right at the top, before I do anything else, I'm just going to await require auth. We'll import that in. And now let's try logging out, and then we can try visiting the profile page. So if I go to /profile, you can see that we get redirected back. So it's a little more cumbersome, but basically any page that needs to make sure you're auth, we're going to have to call this function here. Now, one thing we can take into account is if I've already determined that the user actually is logged in, then this session will not be null. So I can take advantage of that here. So basically I can use TypeScript and say, hey, I know that session's not going to be null because I already checked for it. And then down here, I don't have to check to see is session undefined. So that's one nice thing about checking for the user being logged in first. So at this point, we have a pretty decent setup, right? Users can log in, we have a database, it's storing all of the user info and sessions. Now we're ready to start actually working on features. And so one thing I want to do is just set up a basic guest book. So anybody that's logged in can add a message to the guest book. And now in Next.js, we can use server actions. So essentially we can define functions with the use server directive and actually call those directly from either a user action like a button click or like a form submission. And so if you look at the Next.js docs, they show you how you can implement this, but there are some nice libraries out there that make working with server actions a whole lot nicer. And one of them is called Next-Safe Action. And this makes it really easy to work with actions in a type-safe way, and also to ensure that you're working with validated data. So this library integrates with a lot of different validation libraries, and it makes it so that when you're defining a server action, you can actually specify a schema, and that will always be validated when that action is being called. And then you can write your code inside of your action here. And then inside of your client components, you can directly call that action like so. So this library is really great. And it also has integrations with things like React Hook Form. And so if you're using React Hook Form to do form validation, they have an adapter here where you can actually hook it up to work with next safe action. So you have your schema and your action defined here, but then you can use their built-in functions to help get like validation errors for your form. So this is pretty cool. And one of the things about next safe action is they also have this idea of just direct execution of those actions. So they don't necessarily have to be called in response to a form submission. The way that we have this set up, you can literally call these functions and return anything you want from those functions. Now, there is guidance from Next.js that says you shouldn't use server actions to like query for data, but technically you can. But ultimately, Next.js wants you to only use actions for mutations. And another library that I came across is called Conform, and it's similar in that it allows you to define a schema, in this case with Zod, but I found it typically requires a whole lot less code, especially if you're trying to do like in-depth form validation, and has like graceful fallbacks. So if the user's device doesn't support JavaScript, it's still able to call the server-side action, and there's a whole lot less required to actually hook up these inputs to use the form itself. So I really like Conform. I can see a scenario where you're potentially using both of these libraries in an application. But for the simple guestbook that I'm about to implement, I'm going to use Conform for that. So inside of my app, I'm going to create a folder called guestbook. And inside of there, I'll have a page. We'll export the guestbook function, and then I'm just going to return a card here. So we'll pull that in from NextUI, give it a card body, and we'll give this a max width of medium, automatic margin, and then we'll say, welcome to my guestbook. And then we'll set this H1 to have some larger text. So we'll say this should be text 5XL, like that. And then let's add this page to the navbar. So if we go to our components, navbar, we can, if the user is authenticated, we're also going to push in the guestbook page like that. And so now I have a link to the guestbook and we can get to the guestbook. Cool. I'm actually going to make this a little bit wider by default. So let's do max width large. Cool. And then let's put this text in the center. That looks good to me. So right below this, let's create a form where the user can type their message. So in NextUI, they have this text area component, which is what we'll use just for that. And so right below this, I'll have a form and I'll put the text area inside of the form, pull that in from NextUI. The label is going to be message, and then it'll say enter your message. We're going to set this to have full width. So we'll do width full. So it should fill up the card, and let's see what we get. Yeah, that looks good to me. Let's just add a little bit of margin on top of the form. Sweet. And so now a user can enter a message so like hello world, and then we need a submission button, which will then send it to the backend. We'll validate it, put it into the database, and show it on the page. So let's add a button here. It says create, import that. And I'm actually just going to set this form as a flexbox, so that way I can put some gaps between my elements here. So I'm going to make it a flex column and give it a gap of 2. So that should give some spacing between the elements. And also now the button takes up full width, which is cool. And now that I'm thinking about it, let's add a little bit of margin on top of the card as well. So we'll give this a margin top of 4. Sweet. So if you take a look at Conform, you can see that we first define a schema, and then we can use that schema inside of our action, and then also use that schema when defining the form itself. But what I'd like to do is actually define a database table and then use drizzle-zod to get a schema according to the database table that I defined. So let's do that. We'll head into our database schema and I'll define a file called guest book entry. And so I'm going to have a table where we'll store every single entry in our guest book. Now, I'm actually just going to grab the sessions table as a starting point because it has a lot of the columns that we need, like user ID. So every entry in the guest book table needs a user ID, which is good. And then we'll have a created at date. And in our DB, we'll call it created _at. And then we need a column for the message itself. So we'll say message is just a text column called message, and this cannot be null like that. Now, of course, we should rename it. So this is guestbook entries, and we'll call this guestbook entries. And so that looks good to me. Now we need to export this from our schema. So up top, we'll say export default as guestbook entries from our guestbook entry file. And now that I'm thinking about it, we should probably pluralize the file name too, just to be consistent. So over here, I'm going to rename this to guestbook entries. Cool. And then is this not happy? Let's just do a reload. Okay, everything's happy. Now we actually want to get a Zod schema that corresponds to this specific table. And for that, we can use drizzle-zod. So we can install it with npm, great. And then they provide these two functions where you can pass in the table and it'll give you back a Zod schema. So let's use those. And I'll define an insert guest book entry schema. And this is going to be a create insert schema from drizzle-zod. And then I can pass in the table guest book entries. And so this actually gives me back a Zod validator that will specifically look for user ID message created at. Awesome. Now, when I am actually validating the data that's being sent to my server, I really only want them to be able to send the message, right? Because in terms of security, I'm going to set the user ID on the server side to be the logged in user's ID. And then also created at will get set on the server side as well. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, we can set this to default now. So that way, whenever a guestbook entry is created, it automatically sets that created at date. And so basically for my insert schema, I only want the message property. And so we can actually chain this and use the omit function. So this is just built into Zod. And then we can specify that I want to omit the user ID. And I also want to omit the created at. So now I have a Zod validator that's going to validate that an object has a message property. Now for this example, it's very contrived because I have a single field here, but you can imagine for more complex tables, this is really nice because you can basically strip out the specific fields that you don't want the end user setting, and you don't need to validate those because they're going to be set automatically, but you can get your schema accordingly. So let's make sure we export this, and now let's use it whenever we're setting up our action with conform. So I'm just going to grab this example action here. And now inside of guestbook, I'm going to create actions.ts. And we've defined this here. Awesome. And I also need to install conform. So if we look at their introduction, we can specifically add conform to React and conform to Zod. So we'll install those. And now we can import that Zod schema from our table definition. So I'll pull this from DB schema guestbook entries. And we want specifically the insert guestbook entry schema. And so now this action, I'm going to call it create guestbook entry. It is going to parse the incoming form data, and it's going to use that specific Zod validator to parse that data. And if there were any validation errors, it's going to respond accordingly. And if not, we can redirect. In this case, we're just going to redirect right back to the guestbook page. And we'll also revalidate this path. So that way Next.js knows that it needs to requery the database once we have all that hooked up. And now, once we know that it is a valid guestbook entry, we can actually insert it into the database. So I'll need to import DB, and then we can do db.insert. We pass in the table that we're inserting into. In this case, it is the guest book entries table. So we'll import that in, and then we can specify our values. In this case, submission should have our value, which is the validated value, which just contains the message string. So let's use that in our insert. We're going to say the message is submission.value.message. Great. But Drizzle is complaining because we need to specify the user ID. And so we can grab the user ID from the current session. And so one thing I'll do to make sure that the user is logged in, we'll call that require auth function that we defined earlier. And so now if someone attempts to call this action and they're not logged in, they're going to immediately get redirected. But if they are, we're going to validate it, and then we can grab their session information to grab their user ID. So here we'll say the session is get server session, pass in our auth options, and then we can specify the ID as session.user.id, which we don't have access to, but we want access to it. So let's actually modify next-auth so that way it includes the user's ID in the session. So we can do that by heading into our options. And so within these options, we have access to what are called callbacks. And so we can actually tap into when that session is getting created. So yeah, we get access to the session, and then these params will include the session itself and then also the user from the database. And so essentially what we want to do is we want to set the ID on the session to be the user ID. So we'll say session.id is user.id, like so. And then we'll return the session here. Now we get a type error because the built-in session type doesn't have that ID property, so we need to actually override it. So in our app, we can define a custom type that overrides the session. We'll create a folder called types, and inside of here, we can create our next-auth.d.ts file, and then we can actually override that session type. Now to do this, we can declare a module that is the next-auth module, and then in here, we can override that session interface. So I can define an interface called session, and a session has a user property, and we want that to have an ID property, which is a string, in our case, like a UUID. Now, we also want this user to have all of the default properties of a session, so we can actually import that in and extend it. So if we join this type with default session, which we can get from next-auth, we'll grab specifically the user property inside of there. So now user will have all the properties of a default session, but we're also adding ID onto it. And now that we've defined this type, over here, if we give it a reload, it doesn't stop complaining because actually we don't want to set it on the session. We want to set it on the user and then set their ID to be the user's ID. Awesome. So now whenever a user logs in, that ID property is also going to be on the session, which means over here, we will get access to it. But again, inside of this action, because we're requiring auth, we can basically say that we know this session is not going to be undefined, and we can pass it in here. But actually, this needs to be user ID. Okay, so that should do it. So essentially, as long as the user is logged in and they've sent us a valid submission that has a message property, we'll then insert it into the database and then redirect them. Now, let's get the form submission working. So here inside of conform, you can see that the form has to be a client component because of the hooks that it's using. So let's actually define a client component here inside of our guestbook page. So in here, I'm going to define a file called page.client.tsx, and I will export a function from here. We'll call this the guestbook client, and then we're going to put the form inside of this client. So I'm actually just going to grab this form here and return it. We'll import these components, and then on the main guestbook page, we're going to add that guestbook client right there. Awesome. So at this point, we can start using the hooks provided by conform. So I'm actually just going to copy this example and then update accordingly. Let's update these imports, and then we'll import our action. So our action is actually called create guestbook entry. And so we import that in there. Awesome. Let me remove these comments. And now we can pass in the schema as well. And so in this case, the schema is that insert guestbook entry schema. So we'll import that in. And now we can hook up the form. So if you take a look here on the form itself, we specify the form ID. We can use onSubmit, which gets passed in, and then also pass in the action. So I'll just copy all of this and we'll add it to the form like so. Then we can specify the values here. So we really only need to specify the key and the name on our text area. So the key here is going to be fields.message.key, and then the name will be fields.message.name. So that hooks those things up, and then we can display any validation errors below it. So if we look at NextUI, let's see if they have an error state. Yeah, so with an error message, we can see that we specify the error message property, and we pass in is invalid as true. So let's do that. Here we'll say error message, which is fields.message.errors. Awesome. And then we'll say is invalid is going to be fields.message.valid. And we'll say if it is not valid, like that. Cool. So now this will automatically hook up validation on blur and on input. So if I tab out of this text area, the validation should run. We should see that error if there was one. And then whenever I click submit, it's also going to run the validation on the client. And then after that, it'll call the action on the server, call that validator, put it in the database, et cetera, et cetera. So let's try it out. If we head back over to the page, our page.client needs to be marked as a client component. Of course, we forgot to do that, but this should be a use client like so. And now if we head over to the guest book and I tab out, we can see that the field is required. That's awesome. But check this out. If I disable the on validate function here, we can send it to the server without actually validating it on the client. So let's do just that. We'll refresh the page. Let's take a look at the network. And so if I try submitting with an empty message, nothing happens. I believe we need to set the button type as submit. That doesn't get set by default in NextUI. Okay, so we'll do that. And now if I click submit, it actually calls our server-side action, and then our action responds with the errors, and then those errors get displayed here. So it's important to note that we're actually not even doing client-side validation here. It was able to receive those errors from the server side and then display them on the form. So now if I try putting it into the database, we actually haven't created that table yet. So we should run into some kind of weird like database error. Yeah, I guess guestbook entries does not exist. So let's actually create the migration, run it against the database, and then we should be able to insert guestbook entries. So here I'll do npm drizzle hit generate. That should generate the migration file. And then I'll do npm run db migrate, and that will create that table in our database. Awesome. And now we should be able to create some guestbook entries. So for that, I'm just going to re-enable the client-side validation. And then on our guestbook page, let's display the actual guestbook entries right below that form there. So here, I'm going to grab the entries, and this will just be from db.query.some table name find many, something like that. But one thing I forgot is in our database connection, we can actually pass in the schema, and then we can use this query syntax here. So if we head back over to our database, and then where we define the database here, we can actually pass in some options where we can pass in the schema itself. So if we import all of those tables, so import star as schema from our schema file, now we should be able to query against the database because it knows about all those table names. So right here, if I do db.query dot, you can see we have access to those tables, and I specifically want guestbook entries, and then we want to find many, like so. We're going to make this an async function. And then for now, just to see them on the page, let's actually just show the JSON. So I'm going to do a JSON.stringify of our guestbook entries with some spacing. Great. Okay. Moment of truth. By default, you can see there's nothing in the database. And then I can send a message, hello world, click create. It got inserted. And now we actually see it on the page. That's awesome. So I can add as many as I want. Like it works. Sweet. We see there's some errors happening though. Parse with Zod is not defined. The import got removed earlier when I commented out this code. So we need to just make sure that all of this gets imported. Okay, that looks good. Refresh, and we'll try again. Sweet. So at this point, let's clean this up a little bit. Let's actually show like the message box, and then maybe we have like the user info below it. So for that, I'm actually going to set up a relationship between the guestbook entry table and the user table. So if we head to the definition for the guestbook entries, we can actually define our relations here, and we'll call these the guestbook entries relations, and we can define a relations here from drizzle orm. So we pass in the table, which is going to be our guestbook entries table. And so I'm going to grab an example here from the drizzle docs and just kind of fill it out with my own stuffs. So here we're saying that we want a user, and we'll say one users, which is specifically our users table. And the field is going to be guestbook entries dot user ID, and it references the ID column in the user table. So this sets up the relationship so that I can query for a guestbook entry, but also include the user object along with it. Now I'm going to export this and then also export it from my schema definition. So over here in my schema, we're also going to export guestbook entries relations from that file as well. And now whenever we query for guestbook entries, we should be able to include their user info. So if we head back over to our guestbook, right here, we can pass in a with option. And here we're going to say we want their user true. And so now whenever we query, it's going to attach that user object so we can like show their name and show their avatar. So we can see here that now when this page loads, we get the message info, but we also get that related user info as well. And so to display this, let's actually just use a card from NextUI. They have this cool little example here that kind of looks like a user card with their info. We'll probably do this, but then also have like the message and then like the created at date right there. So let's copy this codes, and then we'll iterate over the guestbook entries and actually display out this info. So we'll say entries.map. That's going to give us each guestbook entry. And then for each one of those, we want to render out a card like so, which is going to come from entry. But now I'm realizing we forgot to put an ID column on the guestbook entry table. So let's do that. It should be a pretty easy change. If we head back over to the database, we can copy the ID field from the users table. We'll just throw that into the guestbook entries table. We'll then generate this migration, cool, and then we'll apply the migration. And now I'm just going to use Drizzle Studio to just go in and delete those existing guestbook entries that don't have an ID. So let's run Drizzle Studio. So in here, if we look at guestbook entries, oh, that's awesome. Apparently, the IDs were able to be generated after running the migration. Beautiful. Okay, we don't have to do anything. So at this point, we just need to render them out. Cool. So if I head back over to the page, let's import all of these missing components and then get rid of this is followed stuff. But now I'm realizing I actually want to put these inside of the card body here. Okay, that's better. And now we should be able to get rid of that max width on these individual cards. Cool. And now we'll just set some margin around each of these cards. So let's just give this a margin of 2. That should give some spacing above and around. Sweet. And now let's get rid of all the extra stuff and fill in our info. So the avatar source is going to come from entry.user.image. And then we can specify their name here, which is going to be entry.user.name wrapped in quotes. And then let's throw their email right here. So entry.user.email sounds good. And right here, we can throw the actual message. So this will be entry.message, and we'll get rid of this extra stuff here. So this is looking good. And then down here, we just want to put when the message was created. So I'm just going to do that with this item here. Let's get rid of this extra stuff. And then right here, we'll throw the created at date. So we'll do entry dot created at. And so this is a date object. I'm just for now just going to say to locale string, and that way it'll just render out the overall date. Sweet. We have a guestbook that has the users, the message, and the date when it was posted. And so we can try again. Wow, so cool. Your site is great. And create it. There it is. Yeah, and I guess another thing we could do is we could sort these where the most recently created is at the top. So let's do that. In our query here, we can specify order by, and we'll return operators dot descending based on the create date, I think. Yeah, so descending fields dot created at. That should work. Yes, so now the most recently created are always at the top. Awesome. Now, before I commit this, I actually want to consolidate my migrations down to a single file. And this is what I was talking about. Like during development, there's lots of things that I forget or that I potentially change. Like in this case, I forgot to add that ID column, and now we have a single migration that literally just adds an ID column. But ultimately, I want that to be all part of a single migration because it's all related and I haven't deployed to production yet. So all of that to say, I'm just going to literally delete this migrations folder, regenerate it. So that way I have just a single migration. And now this is going to be what I'm going to commit to the repo because this has all of my default tables and it makes more sense to have this in a single migration versus like multiple small migrations. Now, before I forget, one thing you should always do when you're setting up a template repo like this is have a sample env file. So I'm actually going to duplicate this file and call it env.example. And now any user that clones down this repo knows all of the fields that they need to figure out. And of course, I'll remove the actual secret info because that's up to the devs to specify themselves, like so. Now that's all the time I have for in this video, but stay tuned because we're going to be using this starter kit that I've created to build other applications and also show you how to do things like deployment and work with more complex schemas and more complex page structures and explore a lot of the other features of Next.js that we haven't explored yet. Now, if there are specific things that you do inside of your Next.js starter kits or inside of a Next.js app that you spin up, I'd love to know about it. Let me know down in the comments. And also if there's anything in particular that you'd like me to explore more or dive deeper into, let me know in the comments as well. All right, that's all I have. I'll see you in the next one.